Oh no, welcome back to the show. Mandala Bam. How is everyone going? As usual, we've gathered 10 albums for you here today. We're going to discuss them, justify listening to them if we can, maybe difficult occasionally, but we'll also be perhaps proposing merits of these within the context of mundane 9 to 5 working life. The leisure class is becoming a thing of less and less and less individual since it has been in the post-war mid 20th century epoch, and so now we're all going to have no choice but to find value in these things as reorientating, intensifying uh, artifacts or philosophic texts with which to retake the cycle slash system from itself. But until then, we'll discuss the merits of their sonic enjoyment. Now, today with me is a co-host. Co-host is going to be delivering their first choice
Yep.
initially, and we're going to be going to New Zealand, I believe.
Yeah, mate. Uh, I just want to preface by saying my name is Turner Fraze from the band Non-Euclidean Geometries.
That's a good one.
Classic group. And even though I'm from Australia, we're also based in New Zealand. This is probably like the third or fourth New Zealand album I've picked. And if anyone out there is wondering as to why, I can only guess that in a sort of prophetic sense, with the coming end of the world, I want everyone to sort of put their praises into New Zealand early, because where are the great winds of the planet not going to blow the nuclear fallout? New Zealand.
Boys.
So you better get in good with them, because otherwise they just won't let you in. But regardless of all that, I guess this album's a fairly recent listen of mine, because I came across it because it shares a member, a guy named Chris Matthews, with the band I talked about last week, This Kind of Punishment. And I was sort of initially kind of taken aback, because stylistically it's very different from This Kind of Punishment. Also production-wise, because most of this I think this was put out by Flying Nun Records, and most of those albums infamously sound like they were recorded with, one mic in a room sort of thing, Whereas this album, similar to the first one I would have chosen, which was the Verlaine's
Way back, yeah.
91 album, that album's got a similar thing going for it, where it was done in a professional studio in Sydney, and it's got this much more sort of industry standard, almost like studio recording, as opposed to the DIY indie thing. But it rather than using that industry standard as a way to dilute it, it's sort of doing the opposite and utilizing these sort of things in a for unique ear candy and stuff like that, whilst also to layer on top of their sort of idiosyncratic songs and stuff, which this album, Stunt Clown by the Headless Chickens, is just a sort of perfect example of. And I think I was reading yesterday that the reason why that this album sort of has that high production quality is because they won some sort of local music award that the government puts out. And despite the fact that apparently there was a bit of a controversy, because I think these music awards were represented, critics would pick them and stuff, and it was sort of the industry would use them as A&R feelers and stuff to find the new up and coming bands that the critics will deem listenable for the wider public or whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas these guys were considered a bit too alternative and shouldn't have won that award or whatever. And despite that, the album still went $9,000 over budget, and
Wow.
you can really hear it, because and apparently the Chris Matthews guy got into debt after that because of it. But that's a great example of an artist, sort of putting their artistic vision ahead of sort of distributional demand.
Logico practical survival in the market capitalist ecosystem.
Sure. And I guess the reason why I chose this album to talk about is because a sort of ongoing theme, or a running in-joke that you and I would have, is about how people from the 80s, they consider stuff like this just alternative, right?
Yeah.
It's this idea that at least listening to this album made me reconsider that perspective. And as far as having grown up in the early 21st century and being exposed to the sort of musical criticisms from, you know, the 21st century onward have sort of become a lot more divergent into sort of classifications of things like subgenres and things like that.
Yeah.
And it's almost like with the advent of that sort of thing, bands would consciously be like, oh, I'm going to be a this subgenre band. I'm going to be a that subgenre band.
Yes.
Whereas this is like a mashup of all the, you know, perpetuating subgenres that came up later, whilst also being, you know, firmly rooted in the sort of new wave school of post-punk songwriting.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, maybe it's just because they're from New Zealand as well, but there's this weird like sort of eccentricity or like eclecticism to it, which could only have come through like you wouldn't be able to get that out of the DIY recording. It reminds me a bit of like Mental Notes, the first Split Ends album.
Yeah.
It's got that sort of playful, like quirky prog thing going on, which is like all over that album.
Yeah, that album reminds you of like Roxy, like first couple Roxys.
And Genesis as well.
Oh yeah.
Because his vocal delivery is
like
when he's
Peter,
not doing the goofy thing, it's very like Peter Gabriel,
yeah.
the fantastical sort of thing, which they Split Ends.
More so in Fairy, that's very true. Yeah.
Yeah. Fairy's a bit more like, you know, pulled back,
Refined.
almost like nonchalant.
Loungy.
And, you know, slacker in a way as compared to like the theatrics of Gabriel.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this album sort of, in a weird way, I'm sure the guy listened to Mental Notes, because that was a very popular album in New Zealand.
Not Split Ends, yeah.
Yeah, but that sort of, strange eclectic songwriting sort of transfers over into these, like, you know, post-punky, but like I was saying, there's so many styles that are touched upon in the album. Almost every song is its own thing. Like, there's even a quasi, like, hardcore track on there, you know? It's just such a interesting, bizarre sort of artistic statement or like vision, you know, sort of fully realized in such a succinct way that it made me believe in that sort of dictum that this sort of music is alternative, you know, rather than having to go into the minutiae of sub-classifications and things like that, you know?
Yeah.
It's it sort of amazed me because of that, you know. It all made sense now, or at least where people sort of came from with these sort of things, you know.
When I would go to YouTube to listen to this album, it's the CD reissues track listing, which includes this album plus an earlier self-titled EP which the group released, Headless Chickens, and I just, partly in the interest of time and also just to get the experience of what the original LP would have been, I chose to just listen to the first, what would be 11 tracks of what would otherwise be like an 18-minute listening experience if you add the tracks from the EP.
Sure.
And so I can't comment on, if you're listening to it now on YouTube, I can't comment on the last 6 or so tracks.
Sure, well, we're just talking about the album anyway. But yeah, it's an expanded edition.
Yeah, essentially why I wanted to do just the original track list.
Yeah.
And this is a very, very good thing here. And, you know, like, it is just amazing how these masterly little things will pop up out of nowhere from nations like ours and our neighbours in the New Zealand. And, you know, because if this was some UK release, you can imagine it by now it'd be on some chart and like, oh yeah, this thing, you gotta know this thing. But like, you know, it's almost just like when Australia and New Zealand do it, it's like, oh, it's cute, you've got one too. Yeah, good on you guys. Yeah. It's like when they look at Americans Wake in Fright and they're like, oh yeah, you Australia, you've got your little world cinema thing too. Good on you. And it's like, you don't get this movie. You don't get how this movie is a lived reality.
That's why I want to get the world
dream.
Sort of, singing the praises before all hell breaks loose.
Listen, it's going to be the rest of the world looking like Middle Earth if we're not careful.
No, yeah, definitely, yeah.
But, you know, I really, really like this album. I enjoyed these Chris Matthews' other group, Don't Panic, what's it?
This Kind of Punishment.
This Kind of Punishment. But I would say I enjoyed this release more, actually. I think there's a variety of sonic curiosities which Matthews and co explore on here. And it's just, they're throwing everything at the wall. This is after the release of This Kind of Punishment album, I believe.
The year after.
So it's almost just like, you know, let's keep going.
It was his next project.
Yeah. And it's interesting that it got some degree of, I don't know if it got any the group gained a bit of notoriety with which they could get but not mainstream popularity perhaps, with which they could get that national funding. Although then, as you said, it doesn't. I mean, I can't imagine Stun Clown being a sort of hit album over there.
No, they had a kind of a hit song in New Zealand and somewhat in Australia. Or at least apparently like Triple J picked it up in '91 with like a remix of one of the songs off their next album.
Yeah.
Yeah, funnily enough. But yeah, other than that, yeah, they seem to have sort of fallen by the wayside of. Perhaps it's like you were saying earlier. It doesn't sort of get international attention because, you know, the English are so hung up with their own music, and America thinks the world is America.
Yeah.
It seems to be more like, at least in my experience, interacting with other fans of music on the internet, like Europeans that'll listen to Australian and New Zealand music for like first and foremost.
You mentioned the French appraisal for a recent album by The Apartments.
Yeah.
Which is would be unheard of even in Australia. I mean, seemingly The Apartments.
Sure, yeah.
They'll praise like a new, like if Kilby releases something new, they'll be like, oh, he's a secret
Still
genius lyricist, and it's like that guy.
Yeah, Kilby's a bit overrated in the Australian sort of press and stuff.
Yeah, I can't think of a rock lyricist who has that meaningful. I mean, very few. It's just like, it's just ridiculous, you know. Maybe some folk singer songwriter guys like Leonard Cohen, and I really like Tom Waits, but even then that might be pushing it.
Yeah, Tom Waits creates quite nice little like beat scenes in his.
Yeah.
He's a clever lyricist, and Leonard Cohen, especially like early on, for like a fairly young man, has a very like poetic and universal perception of his own life. You know.
Yeah. Just for a singer songwriter to have moved me that that sort of kind of uncontrollably, like it is interesting because I think it's just normally like I don't like being taken in by that sort of thing. And just because I'm like I don't know these people. This person wants me to think they're a deep and meaningful, profound person. Like I just can't get into that sort of thing. I have too much cynicism of humanity. But with Cohen, it just yeah, I've been kind of gothically charmed in a way.
Yeah.
It's like he's like kind of this kind of like interdimensional Miyazaki spectre who's come to take me into some ghostly reality.
Sure.
And it's fun like that. A bit like the post-punk guys later, or gals like Susie. But anyway, and post-punk Headless Chickens. Alternative. It's really good stuff here, and I think it is worth one of these days, like just doing the I guess in my own time making sure I've got keeping track of all the great New Zealand classics from the 1980s, because I mean there's a lot of good albums and there can't only be so many albums made in New Zealand in the 80s, and the fact that just random ones we found are good is an interesting sign. Or maybe that's just because the good ones necessarily are gonna rise to the top over time. I guess that's part of that.
Yeah, no, because there is a bunch of like mediocre and just like, oh, that exists, Kiwi albums from then. But there are a few of these people that are seemingly like very lateral thinking sort of artists and come up with these sort of, you know, sideways songs that wouldn't exist from an American or English band, you know.
Yeah, yeah. You have to wonder, like, is it possible for Americans, and British, or Australians even to compose this kind of music? And the answer is, sometimes in some capacity, but there's always a particular uncharacterizable quality about the New Zealand groups, you know, as idiosyncratic as like a Severed Heads or an SPK, you know, Fungus Brain sort of hardcore Australian punk might be. You have Milk from Cheltenham over in the UK. But there's sort of like shameless oddness about the New Zealand bands because they're not trying to connect themselves to some political current as a lot of the punk groups were, you know.
Sure.
We gotta have like they're looking for cred in magazines, you know. The New Zealand bands it's just they got nothing to lose essentially. The Australian bands wanted to be big overseas, or were taking themselves. And it's not a bad thing, but there's some of those SPK Severed Heads, like those bands, they're taking themselves pretty seriously, and I think that's a good thing about them. I like how convicted their music was, knowing that they weren't going to be big overseas, but they wanted to be kind of important music for Australians, and that's great, domestically. Like you go see a band like Severed Heads, you can only read about and buy records of certain UK acts, but you could go down the road and see a group that was taking themselves just as seriously as a Test Department or a Psychic TV or whatever you want to name.
Sure.
Of the 80s.
Apparently, one unfortunate circumstance of these New Zealand bands, though, especially the ones that were a little less idiosyncratic and a little more popular in the New Zealand mainstream, they would sort of garner this a popularity over in New Zealand, and then the next step, because you know how you mentioned Australian bands will try to break overseas.
Yeah.
Their breaking overseas was breaking in Australia.
Yeah.
And apparently that disheartened so many of them, because they would spend like a few years building up this big fan base in New Zealand, only to go over to Australia and have to start square one. In a place that really isn't even that, big culturally at the time.
No, and that doesn't really want to give a shit.
Yeah, and so I think the Kiwi bands who, like, the reason why you do get these incredibly idiosyncratic ones is because they're like, you know what, not even going to appeal to this sort of idea of breaking Australia even,
Yeah.
And it,
yeah,
it sort of reflects.
Very removed, yeah.
And yeah, no, this album's just another great example of it. It's definitely more immediate and enjoyable to a sort of casual listen than, like you were saying, this kind of Punishment, which is very like stark and sparse
and gloomy,
and gloomy, yeah. Whereas this has its moments of like
steelish.
The dark moments on this album are, like you said, that sort of weird, like bizarre, like only from New Zealand thing, where they put this sense of like absurdism into most of their art.
Yeah.
It's sort of it's more that than gloomy.
Yeah, like the unique quality, like as idiosyncratic and kind of beautifully odd the Australian films of the 80s can be, the New Zealand films are even more bizarre and idiosyncratic.
Sure, yeah, that's a fairly decent comparison. Yeah,
I'm very fond of and that'll have to be a fun FOTD one day. New Zealand cinema, there's not in the 20th century. There's not a heck of a lot of it. So it's not that not difficult to track down, from Sleeping Dogs to the likes of Vincent Ward's early work, to whatever the heck else there might be. I could be forgetting something. Taika Waititi's What We Do in the Shadows. That's a fun film.
Sure, that is a pretty good one. Yeah.
Then before he kind of went a bit lame.
He just keeps making the same movie over and over again now. I love it. It's just like these quirky dramedies.
Yeah, including one about like the Nazi Holocaust.
Yeah.
I didn't even watch it. I just don't. I didn't really like Life is Beautiful either.
Reminds me a bit of the Book of Mormon. That Jojo Rabbit thing. It's I'm just like, nah, this is like, it's not even satire. It's like trying to do some sort of like
high-minded bourgeois sort of spectacle.
Yeah,
make them feel clever.
It reminds me of, like, how people think the movie like Idiocracy is a satire.
Oh god, I hate those.
It's like that sort of thing. It's not a satire. It's just a stupid, like, the whole premise of it is like nudging, essentially.
Yeah, it's just for you people to think they're smarter than other people, and the world's going downhill. Well, you're so smart. Why don't you fucking try to do something about it, fucking brainiac?
Yeah, that's sort of what that movie reminded me of. As opposed to, I don't know, I've never seen Life is Beautiful, but isn't that a bit like serious and like sentimental? Or
yes, yes.
Whereas Jojo Rabbit looks like it's snarky and like nudging you the whole time.
Yeah, I just bring up Life is Beautiful because that's often brought up as like a humorous point. How there's that Jerry Lewis film which he never released called The Day the Clown Cried.
Oh, I have heard of it. Yeah.
I think some people. I think there's even a David Cross quote where he's just like, "Oh, it's interesting how like Jerry Lewis wasn't allowed to do this bit in the '90s. Like Roberto Benigni was like considered a genius."
Yeah.
Right? And
won an Oscar for it.
I was like, that's an interesting point. I mean, no one's seen The Day the Clown Cried, or very few people, so who knows how it actually goes.
And the '90s is a bit more removed from the events.
Yeah, and I think, and then who knows how. Maybe like they were handled differently, even if the handling was superficial. But I think that's probably Cross's point in a way.
Sure, yeah.
But anyway, good stuff with Headless Chickens. And the 80s, a very varied decade. It's the decade that's probably been most covered on Mandala, because we're like those people who obsess over the 70s, except we obsess over the 80s, I guess. And we talk about all the little nooks and crannies of the 80s that were like interesting. And that's the real kind of decade, like the last like great album decade. Well, not really. Like there's plenty of good stuff in the 90s.
And I enjoy the sort of pop music from the time because it's all downstream of like the punk songwriting and ethos. It's the proper pop punk in a way.
Yeah. I think there's something about 90s production which can rub me the wrong way sometimes, especially where rock and jazz is concerned. Where a lot of electronic music from the 90s is great, even though it can be a bit like sort of subcultural and sort of I don't know, like how would you say, sort of too oriented around a new trend within EDM, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And the music gets repetitive or dated over time.
Yeah.
Or like not re-listenable, certainly. The 21st century's been really good for
Well, they
music.
siphon all the interesting parts out of a genre like jungle and turn it into like drum and bass, you know, which just takes the tropes of it and, you know, breaks it down into a formula in a way.
Yeah. And if there's any issue with like the 21st century albums are certainly great at perfecting and maximizing old 20th century, early 21st century styles. Although, I wonder, I guess it's just a weird sort of, I wonder if a very new distinct aesthetic is yet to mutate beyond that sort of, social media amalgamation of input, which is the aesthetic of the 2010s onward in a way, sort of a hyper mix of the history of our what remains of our logos.
Well, it'll probably change when we stop letting billionaires buy the global villages community poster board. You know?
Well, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I know, right?
Welcome to the Earth. Welcome to the Earth. Magical Power Mako. From 1980s. Living.
What year was this, sorry?
81.
Oh, nice. I wasn't sure if it was from like the early 80s or if it was like a newer thing doing like a sort of...
No, it's 81.
Sort of thing. No, that's...
Magical Power Mako. He's been around. He's been putting out work since 1974. Born in 1956.
Nice.
He's
Japanese?
got stuff up until 2004, yes.
Okay, because the whole time I'm like, man, what does his voice remind me of? Or like the vocal delivery. It reminds me of YMO doing Day Tripper.
Yeah.
So I was like, this guy's got to be Japanese.
It's this very interesting little thing. The 1980s to people who were born in, say, I'm born in 1996, so people closer to my age, the 1980s is like a bedtime story sort of land. It's like, wow, it's like a very archaic, kind of fun, more less complex version of what we have today, and a more optimistic futurism despite all the Cold War stuff. But you're not as really aware of that stuff when you're a smaller child. And so Welcome to the Earth is a perfect distillation of that sort of optimism, especially in a place like Japan, which is slightly, maybe ignorantly removed from sort of Cold War anxieties and is just only concerned with sort of this upward trajectory, which kind of falls flat on them by like the 90s, let's say.
Sure.
But there was a time when people thought Japan might be the next big superpower, like how people talk about China, or were talking about China in the last 15 years or so.
Oh, definitely. This is like on the verge of... Well, by 81, the dominant electronics, like consumer products in America, would have probably been Japanese imports. Things like Sony and stuff. And then by 81, the cars as well. The cars would have really started to take over by then.
Yeah.
So that's how, Japan were really on the rise. I wonder what was the cause of the decline in the 90s. Maybe it has something to do with those financial crashes that affect, like, South Korea as well and places like that.
I suspect that does, although I'm far from an expert on this.
Yeah.
There was issues there, possibly something to do with the a bit like what was happening in the West, the sort of generational issues.
Sure, yeah.
Lack of individuals' birth rate. I could be mistaken, but the reason I picked this album essentially is because I it's kind of just like almost like a novelty picking this out and just appreciating it as a moment in time. But it's such a blissful kind of idyllic capsule that it does sort of beg consideration and attention. I think, much like the synthesist Howard Groskopf we talked about in the previous show, that there is, except less epic in scope and more about like little novelty ditties, like these kind of songs actually.
Yeah. Little like sort of art rock experiments as well.
Yeah. And I want to point out in particular, I think it's the third or fourth track, I think it's one called Eastworld I Love You, but it's just so gorgeous.
Mm.
I could play it now, but we haven't got any good speakers for it to go through around, because I don't think we get copyright busted if we just played a bit of it. But it's gorgeous.
Yeah, no, it's assuming you're listening to this show, I hope you check out the album. So yeah, this is definitely one where you want to hear it. But yeah, it is a sort of. It's amazing that it's got a sort of naturalistic thing going for it, even though it is made with predominantly synthesizers. I think it might be the guitar tone, because it's just got these playful washes. It just reminds me of being in like a forest, and like maybe because it's sort of also got a bit of a Koji Kondo sort of thing going on as well.
Yeah.
So it might remind me a bit of like playing Zelda if it was like a new wave band or something. It's it's sort of it's exploratory. It feels like you're running through a forest or something. Definitely, yeah, like a Pan sort of situation.
Like
it's the Piper at the Gates of Dawn.
There we go. What we have here is, I think, sonically at least, in respects, the Japanese equivalent to the British minimal wave / minimal synth cassettes of around the same time period. And then that's what's really... it's more kind of sunny and optimistic in YMO than sort of kind of like gloomy punk of Silent Space or linear
That's
movement.
A great distinction I've never thought of as that much, but it's definitely implicit in the music, in the difference between the German and electronic minimal sort of early synth pop and the Japanese is more fantastical, like you know, the
YMO, plastic,
the songwriting of YMO.
Even P Model, which is punky, is very kind of playfully absurdist.
Yeah. Not as like sort of dissonant as say like one of the German.
Not overtly political or sort of kind of hotly abrasive. Like DAF sort of like sense of humor, which is sort of slightly gothic, let's say.
Yeah, well, that's the same as all those English ones. They're mostly like moody and gloomy and reflect the sort of industrial, like post-industrial cities.
Detached, dilipidinized dancing
Whereas
robots.
The Japanese sort of aesthetic, it feels like a technological Arcadia sort of thing, where it's this mixture of the forest, but it's like a mechanized forest or something. You know, it's this technological forest.
Yeah, it's a difference between androids and cyborgs. You know, the Japanese still have a human brain.
Sure. Yeah, the environment is sort of reflective of traditional like naturalistic things, but sort of done through a motherboard.
Yeah, I came across this album when looking through synth pop releases on Radio Music. It looked really fascinating. I couldn't turn it down, and I've been very, very fond of it. I love the synth pop moment in time because it's prior to electronics just becoming ubiquitous in modern music, mainstream music production anyway. And so like it was just like this novelty that they were centering so much of the music around, and it was kind of necessarily experimental and interesting. And before it became beige and boring and sort of like just unnoticeable in the sounds of modern music, which some people seem to like, and they thought the synth era was a bit of an earsaw, but I really enjoy it. I like variety and unusual sounds and sonic landscapes in my music. I mean, I like straightforward pop. I just don't want to be bored, and synth pop is one of the genres that makes me feel the most furthest away from bored. That's all I can say. And an album like this is 34 minutes of fairly blissful memory. I think it's very fine stuff. I think.
Yeah, no, it's a great piece, and every song it doesn't have a weak track as well. It's a case.
I think some of them are a bit repetitive and corny, but if you like old anime fucking theme songs, it's fine.
It goes with the territory of the music, Japanese synth pop. So yeah, most people who listen to that, perhaps if you heard that sort of thing for the first time, it might be a bit jarring.
Yeah.
But to me, I was like, it was pretty sort of natural and playful in the way that this sort of music is, you know.
Yeah, good DIY science fiction oriented musical project, and we're going to go for a 21st century equivalent, aren't we?
Yeah,
next? American.
Next one is somewhere in America. I think probably like
Richmond,
Virginia.
Yes.
Oh, okay. It makes sense then. The theming, the government because of the
federal FBI is there, right?
The federal government, yeah, it's like the intelligence like headquarters, military headquarters of the United States. Funnily enough, I didn't know that. So there you go, yeah. And yeah, this group Energy 2000 is a sort of short.
Is it a group or is it someone's?
It was a group, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Yeah, probably.
No, you're right. It is a group. There, excuse me.
Yeah, like fairly short-lived. It seemed. It's like a. The way I came across this group was back in like 2014, which I could only describe it as like a strange moment of like sort of serendipity, because like it's pretty unknown music, and I guess like for a brief time period I'd sometimes peruse like Bandcamp to see what was there, and that's how I would have come across an EP they had called Zanzibar Special, which is pretty classic. It's a bit like Durruti Column or something.
Ooh, yeah.
And yeah, for about, I guess, 5 years, they were putting out these EPs that are all sort of like the same sort of central idea, this sort of instrumental, like space rock, surf rock, sort of dream poppy sort of stuff. It's purely instrumental, but for all those first few runs of EPs, they use like the public domain astronaut noises from, I think it's like the Mercury 7 mission, the mission that the Right Stuff is based on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it was the US's first venture into outer space, and so it has a strange like sort of like phenomenological effect when you listen to this music, where like the sort of instrumental just in an ambient sense sort of like catches your attention and sort of leaves you in a meditative state, and then all these heavily distorted radio astronaut voices sort of come in and out of the mix in a sort of like a sort of dreamlike, fantastical sort of way. And then the album, or the EP, I guess I chose to pick for this was their last one, called Go Apollo, which sort of, over the course of all those EPs, I think it's like, because they're all about 20 minutes long or so, they must have used up the whole flight of the Mercury 7.
Huh.
And then I guess it's like a swan song, I assume, as the band sort of like, deciding to break up or sort of move on. They decide to use the Apollo mission as the sort of final EP. And so you get this sort of like, this EP is I guess like the culmination of the whole project. And then the big final statement. And I guess the reason why the album, like this is a sort of band I've come back to every now and then over the last 10 years or so, but always forget about. And then recently I remembered them again, and I listened to the whole sort of thing, because they're all fairly short, and it's very natural to just go from one to the other. And by the time I got to the end one, I was wondering why I was so fascinated by the idea. And I think I've just always really liked the age of the space race, and the sort of, through the like late 50s into the 60s, this sort of like existential collective project of sort of like human ingenuity and stuff like that. And even though when you know about the historical context, like it's mostly a militaristic propaganda campaign and stuff like that between two world superpowers, they're in a perpetual Cold War, and so it has this sort of cynical basis to it. But then you listen, like you watch the movies that have been made about it, and you listen to something like this album, and you hear the reflections and like ruminations of the astronauts as that like they come through this sort of very existential sort of space rock music, and it at least for me it makes me sort of, it crystallizes the idea of the sort of the on this beneath the surface of all that politicking and stuff, there was a sort of genuine I feel earnest sort of human sort of expressive thing we were trying to get across in this endeavor. Like mostly evident when probably my favorite track on the album, something called Mare Tranquillatus, and it's the one where it uses Richard Nixon's phone call to the Apollo rocket or whatever, just as they're I think on the moon waiting to leave, and he sort of, it's Richard Nixon, like this is sort of what I mean, and it like it feels sort of like the perfect example of that cynicism in the American government and the politicking of the era.
Yeah.
Richard Nixon's almost the poster boy for that.
Yeah.
But then under that, he talks about how, like, in these very humanist terms, in, like, the deep, rich symbolism of the whole mission, what they're able to accomplish, that, like, the whole world sort of feels like they're, for the first time in humanity, like, this sort of proper collective. And that is an accurate sort of vision, because there's this Turkish guy I know at work who was really old. He was like a kid when it happened. And even in Turkey, like, the moon landing was the biggest deal. Like, they were sort of on board with the whole human endeavor thing, you know, and they're right in the middle of Russia and NATO, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't think they were part of NATO at the time. But yeah, this album sort of just, like, elicits that response in me, where you do realize these historical events, or at least one like that was done with this sort of optimistic, humanist, like, real vision of the future that's, ironically enough, very tied into the hippie vision, but done by, like, you know, the narcs or whatever. They were also entering this sort of metaphysical space, because, like, even Nixon says, you know, the heavens are now part of man's experience. And that was true in a very literal way, and it's a real, like, that is the main moment that is sort of anchors the last 4 generations all together in a way. Like, historians in 500 years, like, the next 50 years after that will be a footnote, or like, you know, that'll be the big moment sort of thing, you know. Yeah, it's weird that an album like that, but yeah, it's just some very concise, like, artistic project that didn't outstay its welcome, and just, you know, is able to sort of catch this sort of zeitgeist, like, cultural moment and harness it into 21st century music in a very particular way. What do you reckon?
You know, it's really good release. And you know what's cool about it? It's the first one I've kind of considerately listened to in full. I've heard you play them before. We've talked about it more than once.
Sure.
You know, what's really cool, I like this idea of taking that big optimistic space age sort of people on the moon moment, and then taking it to this, infusing it with the sort of, like, jaded, detached 90s guitar, like, post aftermath of punk sort of Gen X and / millennial cynicism. It's like a very, very terrific means, an entertaining means of illuminating the dichotomy, and, like, where one kind of enabled the other. You know, that optimism kind of had this sort of huge sort of hangover crash the next morning.
Sure. And that's where the detachment comes in, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I really... Because imagine... It's like the Donald Fagen song, IGY, and what a beautiful world 1982 is going to be. And, you know, 1982 was 1982, you know.
Sure.
It was far from paradise. And that was the 1950s, but there was an idea that people could overcome things. But in the 60s, the Cold War escalated more than ever, for example. So things are just simply not really to be. But it's thoroughly entertaining stuff. They were really on board with, they're really ahead of the curve with this whole, like, not that they are, but they're a collective, but it's like, this is the kind of thing that some chap is making in his bedroom nowadays, of just samples. And they were really onto it in the 2010s, and at a time when they're probably not making this music for anyone except people, their mates, and, like, people checking it out on Bandcamp.
Yeah.
It's a very dedicated endeavor, clearly. Really enjoyable stuff. I'm more than happy to get some mild more promotion for Energy 2000 out there into this discourse here.
Yeah, because they're a band that are probably, like you said, and it seems reflective in, like, the YouTube uploads. There's, like, 30 listens on each one.
Yeah.
It seems like it never really left the local scene. But, which amazes me, because, yeah, it really has potential to sort of capture a sort of audience. Especially one that sort of, idealizes less immediate sort of music, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's also cool to have soundscape music of this sort, which is related to existing sort of semi-popular shoegaze styles, and also that's kind of shorter in length, 20 minutes EP length, because I think it helps people to sooner grasp the idea of these sort of soundscape albums being active and sort of engaging entertainment, rather than simply sort of mood pieces while you're, like, reading a book or studying, or doing your taxes or whatever. All that's online now. I guess you could still listen to music while you're doing them online. There's no reason not to. But yeah, that's so, because obviously like, I do think like this sort of. I imagine a world where like this sort of music, say soundscape, ambient, or experimental music as we understand it in the droney or sort of Henry Cow or sort of like jagged RIO sense, the avant-garde rock or metal or whatever jazz. If that sort of music was even remotely mainstream, even if it had like a major subculture like how metal and death metal has. And there's like an identifiable appeal to death metal and sort of a subcultural sort of as an intensifier, as sort of expression of a sort of like do as I willed way of life. I imagine like a world where this sort of ambient music, ambient-esque music approached the experimental music approached a level of mainstream, like what that could do for the social consciousness at large. Like what would it mean about people's changing pathologies? Would it mean a finer temperament? Because I think ambient music is too often relegated in popular sense to just background interchange, where you could just listen to a YouTube mix of like wind noises or whatever, and it could be all. It doesn't matter if it's ambient 4. It doesn't matter if it's Whoop. It doesn't matter if it's Harold Budd, whoever that any number of ambient artists you want to name, Vapor Material. So what's interesting is that if that sort of music was embraced by a larger set of people that wasn't just sort of hobbyist music enthusiasts relegated mainly on the internet now and in like record shops and like certain college dorms prior to that, new age
the crystal stuff.
Yeah, but I think it would mean that people's attention spans and sort of considerations and appreciation of waking moments might be of a more considered and reflective nature than they are currently, because I do think there's a very visceral appeal to this sort of music, and in a sense that like I pointed out in the previous show how like to me the ambient music compositional philosophy is more in common with that sort of non-classical priorities of say like the rock and punk or like sort of just experimental electronic world in general. Like even though some of the stuff's composed on piano, we'll get to that later. There's such an intent to derive from sensation, in particular like psychological sensation in the listener, rather than formalism.
The paradigm you're describing though sounds like it would be a cultural moment that would be like the next big moon landing. That's how big it would have to be.
Likely it's not, yeah.
It's yeah, like, and people will probably still doubt that it never happened.
Yeah.
It's funny, a guy asked me the other day, do you reckon the moon landing happened? I was like, oh yeah, no, of course. He's like, I don't know, man. And I was just like, well, one thing about the... I was like, how about all the other Apollo missions that went up there between like 69 and 74? And he was like, oh, there were more? And I was like, this always happens.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, there you go. Because he was like a guy who likes conspiracies but doesn't believe in them.
Yeah.
But he's just like, yeah, they always say we never went back. And I'm like, yeah, that's all you ever hear. How come we went once and never went back? It's like, they went like 5 or 6 times.
Yeah. Like after the early 70s, they never went back.
Yeah. That's the one thing I've always found kind of befuddling.
They faked it every time.
Yeah.
First one was fake, but the next couple were real.
Yeah.
Then they faked the last 2.
I think that's a very nuanced conspiracy theorist who knows a bit about history do say that they faked it the first time and they're like, oh, we better do it now.
It's like, oh, actually, the next one was actually the impressive one.
But it's like, oh, what, are you just going to take it all away from Neil and Buzz, are you?
Yeah, these guys who accomplished it on the second time, they don't get any credit. And like, oh, that's where they're coming from. It's like, all right. Well, no, because I was imagining what would happen if ambient music was played in like a social setting or like a workplace setting in a restaurant, kitchen or wherever. There's pop music, there's rock music, electronic music, EDM, and more traditional forms of music, singer-songwriter, folk music. Then there's sort of this experimental ambient world, and people go, kind of, what's going on here? What do we do with it? It's almost more abrasive than death metal, because at least death metal, they know it's for a certain subculture. What's this for? What it's for is knowing that there's, I guess as Plato once claimed, like, you can be an individual in a cave observing shadows, not being aware that there's an entire world outside which is the source of the shadows themselves beyond you, the individual, which is to say, isn't it logical that there's so much more to learn from just perspective and experience, which is to say, there's you know how like certain older generations, like the appeal of like other genres like rock music, punk and EDM is inexplicable. Like there's people from the 80s who do not get EDM, they just don't get it. To me it's obvious, and I think like that's there's that's not there's potential to appreciate all manner of things, and I think that capacity can have very good material results, which is to say we won't be killing each other so much if we can get to that spot. And I think if we can just imagine, if we learn to appreciate all genres of music, how that could be an interesting step to learning how to not want to hurt each other and things like that. And it would be easier to get people to appreciate different genres of music than it would be to immediately right now, just sign all these ceasefires. And so you never know, maybe this is an interesting first step. But maybe I'm sounding too much like a hippie.
You could go full like autocracy and just name every genre alternative.
Yeah. But I like that we were mentioning earlier how about the relationship between Joy Division going through to the Happy Mondays, and I mentioned how the Happy Mondays seem to, while it's not invalidating Joy Division's ontology, they decided that this was in fact a cause to start, now that we have nothing to lose, sort of do what thou wilt in a very wholesome and sort of unaggressive but sort of very optimistic but firm sense. And that's the Happy Mondays existing. And I think in some respects the punk / gig / don't get too mainstream but get a little subcultural cred tradition of punk idealizing groups manifested in a couple of famous groups that emerged in the 1990s in America. One was the Dandy Warhols, another was the Brian Jonestown Massacre, and everyone who gets into those bands just tells you, and there's this documentary I watched about them. Yeah, everyone knows about the documentary.
Yeah, that's one of the more like widely covered music documentaries for some reason. Is it called like Dig?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
I've not watched it myself, to be honest.
No, I haven't either, but like, yeah, it never sounded interesting to me. Well, I suppose most people like it because there's some sort of junky drama that goes on between the bands, But yeah, that and because it's not like a rockumentary, it's trying to do like a sort of a more sort of fresh sort of thing, it's trying to go cinematic, similar to Some Kind of Monster and various other rock documentaries that don't do the rockumentary format.
There's no fly on the wall.
Yeah, like a bit fly on the wall, a bit like Tour Diary sort of thing. But most of even those, like the more artful ones, let's say, aren't that compelling, to be honest. But yeah, that's I'm definitely not an authority on that documentary specifically, but that sort of style of documentary is why I guess would have steered away from it.
Yeah, and also partly because, and I assume you may have felt the same, is that I was never a big fan of either group.
Nah, not really. I only know that one Dandy Warhol song, to be honest. The big Bohemian Like You. And Brian Jonestown Massacre, I would have probably listened to like a few of their 90s albums back in the day, but they just never really caught my attention. Like, I was just like, oh yeah, that's alright. And just never really went back to it.
Yeah, and like my experience was whenever I heard these sort of groups and their famous or most liked material, which is stuff from the '90s or turn of the millennium, there, it just seems sort of like too throwbacky and too sort of like unambitious, which is to say, you know, they were just like, oh, this is the stuff we want to do. We just wish it was that time again. We don't care about anything else going on. And I just found that whole view sort of boring. And so I just didn't really spend time in listening to those bands when I could be listening to the kinds of things I was referring to earlier, like the wide variety, like just like the German music of the 70s alone, for example.
Or like a band that these sort of bands wish they were, the Velvet Underground, you know.
Yeah, like the variety off of 4 albums or just on one, White Heat alone.
Sure.
Like, it's like, why would I spend time listening to however 20-something albums these guys have each? The Dandy Warhols and the Brian Jonestown.
Yeah, I didn't realise Brian Jonestown had that many albums.
Yeah, man.
They've got quite a few. Isn't this like their 18th or 19th album or
something like that. They have 21 albums, so I think it's 19.
Okay, yeah.
There's been 2 after this, I believe.
Mm.
But I saw this album pop up on YouTube, and like then I realised that like...
And it's got a picture of Brian Jones on it.
and I'm thinking... It's got a colour scheme as well. And I'm thinking, you know... I would have always liked to have been involved in this sort of world where you're going from, you know, you're living in some place and you can kind of just going to gigs, being somewhat communal with people, but in a very lackadaisical sort of like serious way, you know, seeing these kind of gigs, you know, having sort of an alternative lifestyle. You sort of like, in a very convicted but sort of playful sense, you drop out of the societal mainstream and you just sort of live to enjoy living like a more modest, less pretentious version of a sort of old school post Sturm und Drang English romantic. And you know, there's such a... I always like that sort of thing. I mean, Sydney tried to have something like that for a bit there in the 21st century, but I think it petered out sort of. Certainly by COVID, it was... Lockdown was done. Yeah. And now everything's indoors.
But it was petering out because most local pubs and stuff were being bought by either Maryvale or Meriton. These two rival like mega property corporations. That,
Plus, the biggest thing may even be just the rents going up to a degree that was just...
That's why those corporations were able to purchase all these places, because the owners couldn't operate them anymore.
Yeah, there was just hostile rises in rent, frankly. If there's no other way to put it. And so...
across the board.
Yeah, so like I imagine a lot of other cities around the world, Sydney was sort of robbed of that sort of gigging sort of lifestyle with like kind of like bands who had the ideals of cycle punk groups were operating in a sort of happy little communal cycle there. And I like the term, though it's not often applied. I really like the idea of the term acid punk, not as necessarily as a genre, but even just as sort of a lifestyle archetype where you sort of embrace the punk conviction of not taking much for granted, say, and kind of having a kind of a skeptic's eye toward one's sort of persona, authenticity, and manipulation, and the nature of power, let's say.
You know, the other, and definitely to do with the nature of power sort of thing, you know, there's this weird paradigm in the social structure of 20th century humanity prior to punk where it's essentially society wants to start embodying the idea of the Ubermensch or something, you know?
Yeah.
And punk's, definitely acid punk's idea is to like sort of slap people out of it by sort of embodying the opposite, right?
Yeah.
This sort of flawed human, you know, reflection of like the opposite of, say, wanting to embody the Ubermensch, right? Trying to sort of bring it back to this this idea of humans as a sort of primordial. We're still primates, you know, and but like intelligent primates, you know, and sort of removing this idea that we're gods or whatever, you know.
Yeah. I've really liked that idea of using the social awareness of, say, if it's in the classist context, the class system context, you use sort of the working class sort of social awareness combined with the more prestigious and sort of kind of at one time very privileged education gifted to the upper classes, and kind of using it to bring human ethical discourse full circle. Because if it's all existing in the upper classes but they don't interact with like the people that they're claiming to be striving to be composing an ethical future for, then there's a sort of disconnect occurring, and then the working classes don't get that privileged education in the first place, which can lead to a certain humanitarian outcome. So when it comes full circle, you get this sort of individual who has the intellect of the upper classes with the sort of grounded and sort of grassroots humanity of which the working classes which is thrust upon the working class simply by the survival, the nature of sheer survival, which is sometimes set upon this that over the world, and I guess if you incorporate the acid ethos to it, it's the acid idea of like opening up one's, say, horizons into more fluid possibilities.
Well, that's why the leader of acid punk was Genesis P. Orange.
Ah, interesting. Yeah.
Or at the very least, like a martyr.
Yeah.
You know, a warrior.
Mm. And so I've liked
the vanguard.
I like the idea of the punk lifestyle while still potentially embracing the possibilities which the psychedelic subcultures propose. Not necessarily the middle class sort of toy sort of Arrested Development dreaming, which some accused the hippies of, or the fashion trend chasing of the hippies, but rather the
Peter Pan hippies.
Yeah. I think it's manifested well in the 90s, and it's fitting that Brian Jonestown and Dandy Warhol are from the 90s, because all that trip hop stuff was very, psych friendly, but, acknowledging of punk and subcultures and local gigs and things like that, certainly in a UK context. And so it's fitting that, Brian Jonestown Massacre and Dandy Warhols do come from that world. And it seems as though when I see the Brian Jonestown Massacre 2019 on my YouTube recommendeds one day, and this is in 2020 or the years following that, and I'm thinking, if this group's still doing what they're doing, and that lifestyle's still going on, and people are still going to gigs and they're still playing, and they're not huge but they're getting by.
Yeah,
I gotta respect that, and I gotta listen to it and hope that it's everything that I would want that sort of band to sound like, and I think that it is. And I think this is a fantastic album. This is what I've wanted this sort of band to sound like. I don't know what the fans think of this album, if they think it's too accessible by the group standards or something like that. I guess I'm not familiar with the rest of the work, but I thought this is like the perfect neo-psych rock album, which is still kind of acknowledging a vaguely punk sort of bohemian lifestyle, let's say.
It's got like the wall of sound fuzz thing, like, quasi shoegaze thing going on, but not to the same degree. It's more stripped back, and a lot of the sonics reminded me of like almost like desert rock,
Cool, yeah.
That sort of, which was also a 90s sort of.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Well. But it because it'll mix in those sort of deserty landscape sonics with like acoustic guitar strumming and stuff like that.
Yes.
So yeah, no, this album definitely did have an interesting sound, and a consistent sound through the songs, and the songs are fairly well written and like simple melodies and just sort of drawn back to us. It feels like it's less going for the pop writing structure and more just like creating songs to fit the album's overall, sort of sound. It feels more like an oral album than say like a singer-songwriter thing, or like a pop song album.
Yeah, I get you.
And the songs that they do write are very serviceable for that. The longest one on it, it's interesting. It reminded me a lot of. There's a song on the First Saints album that has almost the same chord progression, though it's a very common chord progression. I've heard it in a million other songs as well. But the vocal melody is very similar as well. I'm like, yeah, wow, I can't believe that. I wonder if they're fans of the Saints. But so yeah, no, there are touches of these like little like sort of interesting. It almost feels like it's DIY as well. Like it's not too flashy or anything. Like say when a band like the Arctic Monkeys have put out albums recently, and they're like really overproduced. And
Oh
like,
yeah.
you know, the songs are overly written and things like that.
Mm.
Whereas this is like way more casual and definitely embodies the sort of thing you were talking about earlier with the gigging lifestyle and the sort of like acid punk philosophy.
Yeah.
And like I guess you could say I haven't quite completely drunk the Kool-Aid on the album yet, but I think it's intriguing enough where I could see like checking out the other albums around it after listening to it again at some point, because it definitely has something sort of particular going for it, you know, like it feels like they were going for a certain like almost like I was gonna say desert, but it's more like the moon. You know how the moon, like we were talking about before.
Yes, well.
It's like a desert in space, like this isolated object, and it's more like that. So, like it's neo-psyche and space rocky, but in the way that you feel grounded to some sort of like charcoaly, you know, floor.
Yeah.
And that floor being the overall sound the album's going for.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, no, I definitely do appreciate it for that. It was an interesting listen. And yeah, it felt like a veteran band, like just doing what they can do best, you know.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sure the releases around it might be pretty consistent. I'm curious to check them out.
Oh yeah, I really love the idea of the Americans having a great adoration for that '60s era of like British psych pop, especially. I mean, the British bands are sometimes homaging it in the '80s. You know, some of the
there was
bands.
that's sort of where neo-psych starts, eh?
Mm.
Those British prestiges.
Talking about psychedelic furs a couple of weeks back. And also,
Yeah.
a couple of the other ones are trying, like even like I think more so than some of the other ones, Echo and the Bunnymen were trying to do a neo-psych thing sometimes, or a neo-60s thing sometimes.
Definitely a raga thing, because the sound on Porcupine is definitely going. You know, you think about the opening riff to the Cutter.
Classic.
It's like a post-punk raga, like, you know, sitar sort of noise, and then they carry that over into the guitar work on Ocean Rain. You hear that, and then when they drop that neo-psych like raga thing, is then the subsequent album, the self-titled one, and they sort of lose something, don't they?
I don't mind that album, but it's worse than the first four. The album, the 1990 album's very neo-psych, most obviously so.
Sure, yeah.
To the point where it's just full. It's like, you know,
that's just the scenes
post that homo, that thing coming out.
The scene's
you know.
full kicking in by 90. Yeah, definitely.
Taking advantage of that in a way. I wouldn't say capitalizing. It seems like an earnest album, and I do quite like. It's better than album 5, definitely. I don't dislike album 5. I kind of like that cliche music. That kind, I'm not gonna lie. But
there's some good songs on there, but I'm more talking about the overall sound of
the production's a bit not as exciting, yeah, for sure.
And they consciously strip back the psychedelic elements to try to have like hit songs and stuff, you know, radio songs. It's almost like they're permanent waves or something, you know.
And another one that was apparently, you know, I didn't spend enough time with the group, but I'd like to, because people like, you know, who are very serious about that era, from the era, are very fond of the Soft Boys, and that was like very distinctly neo-psych. But I'm very fond of Robin Hitchcock as a solo album. I don't think it's his first solo album. He's from Soft Boys. After Dream of Trains. He's one of those there's a few guys who claim that their careers, if Syd Barrett kept going, that's what they want it to be. Apparently David Bowie said that at one point.
Yeah, wow.
Sometimes I feel like that's Martin Newell's. I don't know if he's a Syd Barrett guy, but he always feel that way about Newell. And Robin Hitchcock apparently definitely said that. And After Dream of Trains is a very interesting LP, which maybe we'll discuss next week. So the British are doing that. They're homaging their own neo-psych.
Yeah, Kid Drop Explodes as well.
That's a good one. That's a great example. Yeah, of course. I forgot about them.
Because them with the furs are right at the start of that.
Yeah. And I like it when the Americans are doing it, both around that time and going through.
Yeah.
And one of the more interesting characters is someone who was of the age. He turned 20 in 1969, but they were turning 40 in 1989 is when they're releasing their music. Are you gonna talk to us about Dogball for a little while?
The next one is I guess the first time I've double dipped on the show.
Somewhat, yeah. It was a collaboration album with someone called Kramer.
Yeah,
on Mandala 1, we talked about the 91 album. Hot Day in Waco.
Yeah, Hot Day in Waco. But this one's Cyclops Nuclear Submarine Captain is an earlier release than that one. And it's
Oh, no,
just
this is 91 as well, right?
Okay, I thought Hot Day in Waco was a few years later. I thought it was like 94.
It might be. I could be wrong. Yeah.
I think it's 94.
Okay.
Whereas, yeah, no.
This one's definitely 91, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And, yeah, like you're alluding to earlier, it's sort of... It's like where the Americans came in, I guess a little late to the neo-psych game, because there are a bunch of, like, 90s neo-psych bands, like I'm thinking Mercury Rev... Flaming Lips, et cetera, et cetera. There's plenty of them. But, I didn't realize this guy was that old.
The previous band we were just talking about.
Yeah, Danny,
Brian Jonestown.
Brian Jonestown, sorry. Yeah, I didn't realize Dog Bowl was that age when this was released. That's interesting. Because, yeah, you do feel like he...
I could kind of tell he was an older man. I just felt like only an older man who'd been around for a while would give themselves a name like Dog Bowl. Like, what young person would give themselves a name like Captain Beefheart? Well, Captain Beefheart strikes me as someone who was old even when he wasn't. Maybe because of his voice, I don't know. And a name like Don Van Valet just doesn't strike you as a young person's name.
No, that's true.
But yeah, Dog Bowl is just what young person. It seems like he's Moondog. Like
yeah,
think of a young person naming themselves Dog Bowl. It's just not very common, I think. Unless maybe he's like a metal or like kind of a abrasive rapper. I don't know. Like now, but even then, like some Memphis rapper. I don't know.
But yeah,
36 Mafia associate.
Yeah, yeah. It'd be Dog Bowl, but with some sort of like strange way of writing it out or something.
Dog Bowl asterisk.
Yeah. Whereas, yeah, I guess this is more in the vein of that sort of like a
outsider singer songwriter.
The other day I was just reading the RYM reviews of this album, and I found it sort of curious all the references to other artists that it sounds like it takes inspiration from. This all the like alternative artists from like the 60s through to the 80s are pretty much listed by people.
Yeah.
Except for one I didn't notice was the Fugs.
Okay.
And it kind of, yeah, a name like Dog Bowl as well comes from that sort of Fugs, sort of like sardonic school of like freak out.
Yeah, it was these American like weird humor magazines of the 70s.
Yeah, definitely.
College humor
like,
sort of thing.
Yeah, even there's a song in the album called like Toilet, and that feels like it's something out of like Mad Magazine or something. And yeah, there's this weird sort of like absurdist like nerdy psychedelia thing going on throughout the whole album. Like one thing like I noticed about it is that the earlier songs are all these strange like psychedelic, like pre-modernist psychedelic visions of like futurism, like this sort of world where like airships and zeppelins are like the main sort of technology.
Sure,
and
yeah.
this weird sort of like like early 20th century futurism. And then as sort of the album goes on, it leads into like the sort of more UFO age, right? And then like the last song's about how like people meet at the shopping mall or whatever. And it just feels so appropriate. You go through this sort of weird almost like Logos inspired like cultural perspective of like America throughout the entire 20th century. And I guess it's just done through all these like very like avant-garde sort of like remember the way I would have described Van de Graaff Generator or that early prog as like scrappy prog.
Of course, yeah.
It almost feels like that, but then mixed in with like sort of like post-punk indie rock as well, and then all these sort of strange, because it's fairly lo-fi, but it'll be all these strange experimental sort of like freak out jams, then mixed in with these like psych pop, like you said earlier, it made sense that he was an older guy as well, because like the songs feel very mature and like sort of like beautiful in a strange way. Like the third track on the album is like one of the best pop songs I swear I've ever heard. It's just ridiculously like, I can't believe it's such a lo-fi thing that you can write such a sort of pristine song. And so yeah, I really appreciate this album for its strange like nerd sci-fi sort of the bizarre, like, yeah, Mad Magazine mixed with like pulp science fiction magazine world that it takes place in, and it feels like it's like, I guess similar to Martin Yule. Like, I feel like this guy is like a very like intimate songwriter, and is able to like sort of extrapolate these very inner particular feelings into a sort of like a universal experience that like he'll frame through like childhood experiences and hobbies and things like that.
Yeah.
It's the sort of thing that good like Pulp Fiction can do as well. It's sort of like, yeah, like a Pulp Fiction indie rock like prog album or something.
Yeah.
With yeah, I don't know. It's sort of like a bit of an overlooked classic of that early like American neo-psych era. Like yeah, I'd put it up there with like the the Mercury Rev albums of the early 90s. This is sort of strange sort of thing. Though those are a bit more, I guess what you'd say, like noise pop and stuff like that.
Sonic Youth-y.
Yeah. Whereas this is a bit more steeped in like a sort of playful pastiche,
Yeah.
whilst trying to be
out there. That weird southwestern psych.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure where this guy is from, to be honest.
Yeah, we're going between. He's from the Bronx.
Oh wow, really? Yeah, I assumed West Coast.
Yeah, you get the image of like this guy being like one of those like, just like traveling American songwriters or something. He's just like so attuned to the art of like composing one of these like beautiful stories of inner melody.
Sure, yeah. His melodies are really, yeah, they feel timeless in a way.
Yeah, the two most powerful immediate songs on here, I think it's because I've heard them being played before, is the title track, which is the second track, Cyclops Nuclear Submarine.
Oh, that's
Captain.
great, yeah.
What lyrics.
Yeah.
What like kind of mutated Syd Barrett lyrics those are.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Silkworm Exploding, which is like the song that
that's classic,
Neutral Milk and Flaming Lips and all them wish they could have written.
Yeah, 100%, yeah. And I love it's got this weird, like, narrated wiggle-sounding outro. Yeah, I never thought about that in terms of Neutral Milk or Flaming Lips.
Just the horn section.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
It's very pretty. I like that really a lot. But God, like, very engaging album. And for an album that's, one of these, like, 50-minute album, like, an hour long, actually, 58 minutes, so yeah, pretty much. It's consistently engaging.
Yeah.
Yeah, good on the guy. Dog Ball seems like a fascinating sort of character. And I assume he's one of these guys who you just see obscure gigs of, throughout the country and like kind of alternative venues and like record shops and things like that.
Yeah, and it makes sense that you said the Bronx because Kramer was like from New York Gong and had like the label this is released on, Shimmy Disc, was like a New York label and stuff.
I see, yeah.
So it definitely would have been like like a sort of New York thing. These weird like dive bars would have gigs where these sort of bands play.
Yeah, New York's interesting in that like a whole like variety of subcultures can flourish because there's so many people there and so many buildings, there's so many businesses to operate in, and at certain times in history, pretty cheap rent. Like the no wave scene flourished because rent was so cheap in New York, so people could just like
and squatting as well.
Yeah, there was no laws against squatting. The same with London in the 70s.
Yeah,
where it's like for example in Sydney now, like squatting's a big no. Like if the real estate gets any evidence that you're squatting, like they'll happily get the police involved, and the police will happily go, "Can't squat, mate."
It's not on.
It's not on. No, you've got to follow the rules. Become like me, and bash people.
Yeah, and taser your grandma.
And then potentially and then you either bash people up or get killed yourself. Yeah, what a world. It's like going to the army back in the day. Gallipoli!
Yeah, well they're just a government gang.
It's almost like that thing they tell us we should avoid like every year. Anyway, twice a year. Anyway, no, that's Dog Ball. There's Cyclops Nuclear Submarine Captain. Really good album. I like this sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, it seems like a very charismatic, weird out there person.
I was going to ask, do you know much about the rest of his work?
I mentioned in the other episode, he's like also a science fiction author.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
And
one of the few who have contributed to music, because did he write the novels first?
Sorry?
Did he write the literature?
I think the novel's from like 93 or 94.
Okay, so a bit later.
So while he's doing music.
It's like It's like how Michael Moorcock had like a little bit of music in the 70s before contributing to like Hawkwind and BOC and stuff like that.
Yeah, he did lyrics and stuff, right?
For those bands, yeah, but he has a couple albums, I think.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know how well regarded they are, but they do exist.
Okay, that'd be a kind of cool novelty.
Yeah, I've not heard them. I know of them. I don't know much about them other than I think they of that Hawkwind sort of genre.
But yeah, I guess he was a musician first and foremost. But yeah, I haven't heard that much of his other stuff.
Well, he's in King
except
Missile,
for-
right?
Yeah. Which they, as I mentioned in the other episode as well, had a weird, like, alternative hit in Australia, a song called "Detachable Penis."
Sure, you mentioned that. Yeah, I remember that now. Yeah.
So yeah, like all these older like Gen X Australian people I work with are like, oh, check out King Missile. I'm like, King Missile? No, that's Dog Bowl, I swear. And I look it up and I'm like, man, yeah, I haven't heard this Detachable Penis song, but I'm a fan of this guy's like solo material, I guess.
Yeah.
And yeah, the other one I heard is the other Dog Bowl and Kramer, which is called Gunsmoke, I'm pretty sure.
Yep, you're right.
Which is pretty good. Not quite as good as Hot Day, but good stuff.
Mm.
But yeah, he's got quite a few albums, it seems.
Yeah, interesting guy, it seems, yeah. Just these oddball, like, idiosyncratic kind of American traveller types. Seems like a tried and true tradition, and they kind of, like, find the American soul at the heart of, like, each new genre that pops up, which is considered new and abrasive.
Mm.
And do we have to move on to another New York act next? Are we moving on? We're moving on
Yeah,
from Dog
New
Bowl?
York.
I need
Kiss.
Yeah, like this. I'm gonna like kind of turn the tables. Like, what do you think of Octavarium by Dream Theater? And let me try and explain it afterward, I suppose.
Yeah, if you want to do it that way, that sounds like a sweet as idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not really that familiar with their other albums.
Yeah.
And I know Dream Theater have like a pretty dedicated fan base, and by the nature of because they like are Rush fetishists or whatever.
Yes.
And by the nature of Rush, I'm pretty sure they decided to do the same sort of thing where there's like at least definitely the fans have this idea. There's just like unconfirmed like narrative of what each album means in the evolution of the band or whatever.
Yes.
So with this album, I can't speak to any of that.
Yeah.
I'm just observing it as the album as it is, and it's not terrible. It's very serviceable, But I would come up with, I suppose, like if I was in there with them, like producing or trying to help them come up with the ideas or something, I'd either say like, all right, we got to bite the bullet on these like melodies and stuff, and either go in the direction of full like prog metal, the experimental stuff, and all the interlude sort of sounds and shit like that, or go in the more commercial direction, I suppose, because like technically they're all like amazing players, quite obviously, and I guess Mike Portnoy is like fairly renowned as like one of the best like rock drummers or whatever, or at least definitely metal drummers.
Yeah.
The typically metal drummers are considered like the best rock drummers because it's normally fairly technical.
Yeah.
And this is like technical for that. Similar to, I guess, his idol is like Neil Peart from Rush.
Oh yeah,
right?
I assume, yeah.
And so it seems like they're a band that could definitely lean into that world of like, say, like instrumental, heavy, like prog metal, sort of like out there labyrinthine music, or because I feel that's what their style's more suited to, because the thing that would let this album down the most is it's sort of the pop sensibilities are very drawn from the day.
Yeah.
The sort of I'd call it like post grunge, like pop sensibilities, which is a sound that is like it's indicative of its time, and it's not the like there's been worse sort of sounds in the history of popular music.
Sometimes, yeah.
But I just like as I was listening to it, I just feel like they're sort of like do you remember the second track?
Yeah.
It sort of sounds like
Yeah.
if they mixed Oasis with Coldplay.
Yeah.
With
like emo sort of ballads.
Sure. And
Yeah.
I don't know that much about the band, like I say, but I feel from listening to the music like they were sort of not like familiar with, like they don't seem like fans of music that's based around like pop sensibilities.
No, I wouldn't imagine.
And
so.
studied in that, like they're very
Maybe
technical.
the boring or Rush songs that are like that, and there's a number of them.
Sure.
Or a couple.
Well, they seem like very technical-minded musicians,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so they're not leaning into their strengths.
No.
Right? And when they do lean into their strengths on the album, it sounds really fucking good. Like, you know, you just find yourself bopping along and like, yeah, no, this is great metal, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's just a shame, I suppose, that they let that get a bit out of hand. I'm not sure why. Maybe they wanted to sell more albums or...
Probably, yeah.
You'd assume, I suppose.
I guess so, yeah.
But, like, see someone like the Brian Jonestown guy, like I was saying earlier, the way he was incorporating his sort of pop songwriting, and he feels like a veteran of, like, he seems like a guy that listens to that sort of music, right? Whereas Dream Theater feel like they're more like technically minded people who listen to prog, essentially, you know?
Yeah,
like complex metal, like the, you know, Yngwie, Iron Maiden sort of power metal stuff, I'm sure.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And like, you know, the keyboardist is a bit like John Lord or whatever, who's like a kind of proto-prog guy.
Yeah.
As opposed to like... So when they are trying to write like pop songs, you know, it feels like it's an imitation... That is very indicative of the time, because a lot of music, like pop music and like post-grunge popular rock music from that time do like just all use very similar melodies and like sort of a very stark way of building the song up, you know?
Yeah.
Whereas this album, when they are like less restrained, is where the best material is, I reckon. At least that's how I felt listening to it for the first time. Like the title track, for example.
Yeah.
Is definitely best when it's instrumental.
Yes.
Like it's almost, you can feel the weight of the epic.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Dream Theater fans are a huge fan of like their melodic stuff or whatever. But I just felt it got in the way of like the meat and potatoes, you know, and the sort of the dessert wasn't as, you know, they're a band they're like chefs. They're not pastry chefs, right?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. I guess I'll
But it's definitely, it was worth the listen. I'm glad I did listen to it.
Oh, that's interesting. So I'll give a little bit of context as to where this album fits in the kind of Dream Theater story. So you have the 90s work, you know, the big albums of the second album.
I've heard some of that stuff, yeah.
The Untouchable album is the first album, kind of people don't really... It's vaguely dismissed. I'm not the biggest fan of it. Different vocalist, more commercial. Then the second album is you know, that's the prog metal album, you know, Images and Words. And some tracks sound slightly commercial in their choruses, but there's, you know, 8-minute songs, very instrumental. It's thoroughly prog metal. Awake sounds like prog metal now, but then it was considered too commercial by a lot of fans.
Okay.
Interestingly enough. Now it's like a sacred cow, interestingly.
Oh, really?
Which is fascinating.
Yeah.
That's like many people's favourite now. The next one was considered too commercial, but now that sounds a lot more prog metal than some things that came a bit later. And then there was the big Metropolis Part 2, the big epic. I find that one a bit boring. That's where I'm a bit unlike... I like Dream Theater, but that's one where I find it really boring. It's just a dumb story album.
The prog seed or whatever, they're always like, oh, that's a great
Scenes
one.
from a Memory. I don't care for it, frankly. Then the three after that were very just instrumentally minded. What are they? 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence and Train of Thought, I believe. That's kind of just a full metal album, and it almost is kind of...
Is that the album from before this one?
Train of Thought,
Because I saw the cover of that, and you know what the cover of that album is?
That abandoned house is near Showground Road?
No, it's actually specifically a style that was all over the early 2000s. It's called like grunge graphic.
Cool, yeah.
Yeah, you know how everything, all graphic art in the early 2000s had like fake smudges on it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It looks like it's spray painted on a wall.
Oh, the 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence is what... yeah, that's what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's Train of Thought, and then there's Octavarium. Yeah.
Okay.
I know exactly what because you've brought this up before. 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence.
Okay.
For the kind of the wall with like the rusty sort of look.
Yeah.
Because I was going to say the house.
Also read
that
apparently...
house on Showground Road, the abandoned house.
Oh, okay, yeah, no, that's not the one I was thinking of. Yeah. That does kind of look like that.
Including if the eye.
But, yeah. But apparently, as well, I was reading, they released a live album, a New York live album on September 11th that had, like, a bleeding heart logo with the towers in there.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, holy shit. They had to, like, recall it or something.
Yeah.
Man, well, that's bad luck.
Yeah. Like, this group, and then, so 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence and Chain of Thought I really like. And you get to Octavarium, and so Octavarium is half, like, the instrumental epic stuff, and half these, like, more ballady sort of, self-reflective songs. And here's the story, guys. Dream Theater fans already know this. This is Mike Portnoy, like, Has to Go Sober Now album.
Oh,
Drink
really?
Anymore. And so that's where the writing of the album's coming from. And that's where the seriousness, sort of, like, no fun allowed. We need to be kind of grown-ups now. Nature of this album comes from. And that's why, like, in the way that, like, Grace Under Pressure is, like, a really depressing album about these guys coming to terms with death and nuclear apocalypse and getting older and less virile and all of that and having kids and being scared your kids might die and what future they're going to grow up in. Octavarium is that album from Dream Theater, and I find it pathologically fascinating. It's almost a scarier space than any metal album can send you to, seriously, but more depressing, dark place than any black metal album by guys in their early 20s, because, like, what do they know at the end of the day? I mean, some of them have been through traumatic shit, but in Scandinavia, like, those are pretty happy places. They're cold, though, to be fair, and cold can make you angry. But anyway, but that being said, like, so I find this album pathologically fascinating, but it's so flawed. Like, I've said this about other albums, like Genesis 1983. I've said this about, there's a couple of other albums I've said this about, but I don't remember what they are, like, other than that. But Octavarium's another one where I'd love to hear this instrumentals, because, like, I'm not a big James LaBrie fan at any point, even in the 90s before he had the food poisoning and his voice apparently got bad for a while.
What? Food poisoning?
Something like that, yeah.
Gee.
And, like, goddamn, like, I like the idea of Dream Theater as being, like, putting out these, like, Rush-esque epics in, like, the kind of cozier pre-GFC 2000, and you just kind of, like, you come back from your office job and you just listen to the Dream Theater CD thinking, on a Friday, thinking, fuck yeah. I wrote a little passage about this once where, like, you'd be the most shameless person in the world. You don't care about how about needless facial hair, you won't care about how many dry vaginas you inspire or the size of your waistline, and in a roundabout way, that would be paradise. But you don't have to worry about the real world problems which lead to people like Mike Portnoy doing Octavarium, which I'm going to call the album his therapist told him to make. But
well, what you just described is the philosophy of the cynics from ancient Greece. And yeah, like, I suppose that's this album's biggest letdown in a way, is, like, it feels cynical, but, like, also earnest at the same time.
Yeah.
It's like, definitely the construction is a bit cynical, but, like, with the sort of, I don't know, metaphor you described of it being about, like, sort of the ending to his youth or whatever, or, him sort of, Mike Portnoy, I suppose, conceptually being, like, given a rude awakening to adulthood or something.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just a shame that they didn't express it in a way that was a bit more earnest,
I agree, yeah. It's like,
which is probably its flaw.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's a Dream Theater album I find the most fascinating in some respect, because it's such a fascinating point in time, and I can imagine listening to this in 2005 because now it sounds like a relic of the 2000s, but at one time it would have sounded like Dream Theater trying to sound modern.
Yeah,
exactly. And trying to grapple with
yeah.
the modernity, and now it sounds a bit sloppy, like any older person trying to grapple with, like, music that's, like, 10 years younger than them, say.
Sure, yeah.
And I have read quotes like Mike Portnoy was like, our fans just can't handle that. We like bands like Muse and Coldplay, and we want to make music like that. And
did you say Coldplay?
I'm pretty sure I've read something like that somewhere, yeah.
Wow.
I've read it from Wikipedia. Yeah, you could go, it's probably still there.
Because, yeah, like I said, that second song, but also the last song, the title track.
Oh, yeah, when it sings
when he has that melody, it's like,
as my conscience slips away.
It's ripped from Coldplay.
Chris Martin or something.
Yeah.
Mike, it's just such a... So it's like them being influenced and liking younger bands, but not really knowing and trying to, oh yeah, so we like them, we can fit in, but it's more than just liking these bands, you know what I mean? You got to do more than like them. You got to kind of embody them in a way.
Sure, yeah.
And it's hard for older acts to kind of embrace what younger groups are doing. So it's happened, but it's you gotta. You got to be aware of
I guess at the very least you can
surroundings
commend
of
it
these.
because like they could have gone the opposite way and gone like more traditionalist, like say what the modern Pixies reminds me of.
Oh, that's stinky, yeah.
Yeah. At least you can applaud the effort on something like this where they are trying to take influence from newer groups and update themselves within the pop music world or the heavy metal music world.
Even as a straight heavy metal act, I mean, Train of Thought's more straight heavy metal, and I really like that album. The Root of All Evil, like, I don't like the vocal track on this one, but as a straight heavy metal instrumental, the opening track is really cool. The Answer Lies Within, I think they all need a punch in the gut for that one, I'm not gonna lie.
What year is that?
That's the second track on here.
Oh, sorry. I thought you said that was an album. Yeah, the second track. What's it called?
The Answer Lies Within.
Yeah, they're trying to imitate a bit too much, unfortunately.
Yeah, and like I said, I think the first track is a really good metal instrumental, if nothing else, but I don't like the second track so much. These Walls, I feel the same way as I do about the first track. I Walk Beside You, the fourth track, I feel the same way as I do about the second track. And Panic Attack, I feel the same way as I do about the first track and the third track. And Never Enough, pretty much the same thing, but the vocals aren't so bad on that one. And I like how that's a song, like, I like that they just put out a song about how they're annoyed with their fans.
Oh, nice.
Like, the lyrics are so blatantly about that. You there's like, oh, everything is never enough, like, no matter what we do. It's like I kind of like, you think it's just some song about like about a nagging or kind of, demanding girlfriend, but no.
Seemingly their fans are like fanatics, right? And
yeah, they're very...
It seems like similar to Marillion. They were like early to the 90s, like message board forum sort of things,
Yes, Marillion were supposedly, yeah.
Marillion, but also this band.
Probably, yeah.
It seems like they were getting their albums like leaked and stuff.
Yeah.
On these forums and shit. That's probably why he wrote that song. That's interesting. Yeah.
Well, because
it's similar to like say someone like even Doom. He was getting his shit leaked and similar case.
Well, Kanye West College Dropout is
and once
changed
again
the album.
A similar sort of thing. Yeah. It's interesting that they have sort of that relationship with the very fanatic group of followers.
Well, it's interesting because the fans treat the pre-existing material like it's divine, like it's the word of God and it's all perfect and you analyze it. So when you add something to it that's not immediately part of that canon that you've been listening to for 3 years and it sounds slightly alien and different, you're like how can anything compete? You know what I mean? Like anything's going to sound like not up to scratch at first because you've got such high expectations. Whereas I think sometimes people get into these bands with more material as pre-existing, they sooner accept it than it's like, no, if this doesn't gel with my idea of the band. Sometimes it's just your age and like what trends you're into at that point in history, whether it's the late 90s or the mid 2000s or whatever. But it's just one of these things where the Dream Theater in particular like had just real angry fans, and Dream Theater didn't even sometimes change up their sound that much. The fans would just be angry that no, these just compositions aren't as good as the last ones, and it's like they're not even experimenting with a different genre, and they're pissed off sort of fans. So they just seem ruthless and cranky, but I think they're a bit more forgiving nowadays. But anyway, Sacrifice.
They all grew up.
Yeah, eventually. By the time they hit 40.
They listened to Octavarium enough times.
Yeah. The Sacrifice Sons is this weird song where they think we're going to do a serious song about 9/11 because like why not? Like why is this considered tacky? Wow. And it's like, look, listen to the results. That's why it's considered tacky.
Sure.
Because it's not like just. It's not like it's you doing a song about some battle in World War II that's like years ago. It's like you doing a song about like. It's like. It's not. It's the public's event. It's not like a matter of history. I mean, it's recent history, but that's kind of the problem. Like, I don't know. Like, it just doesn't.
And they're a New York band as well, I guess. But yeah,
I get that component. I
didn't even realize the song you were talking about was about 9/11. To be honest.
It's got the chanting at the start, like it's
Okay.
just like, you know, the walkie-talkie, and then the news reports you hear. It's just like, I don't know, man. Like,
Yeah,
I just feel like, you know, why can't we do a prog song about 9/11? Well, because the result is this song. That's why.
Yeah.
Because it can't not be this song, and like, I don't know, man.
Yeah,
like,
no, 'cause-
I'm thinking to myself, am I
It's a bit
wrong for thinking it's like a wrong idea? And I'm like, no, the song's just lousy and so enough.
It's a bit Oscar bait, or
It's
like,
such a like newly sober, like weird idea.
like you know, I forget what
Farrapher
was.
said it was a good
It
idea.
was probably a show like South Park or something, like would have satirized.
Oh, Ladder to Heaven, yeah.
Not that the media coverage. It might not have even been South Park. Some show of how, you know, all the people that do these stories like a 9/11. They're like, when it happens, they're like, oh, here's my chance to win the award.
Right.
You know, for
right.
the industry awards at the end of the year for news media.
Mhm.
And they'll win those, like, because of these tragedies and stuff like that.
God, yeah.
It feels like that, like Oscar bait, but that's for news.
Yeah, but no one's going to hear this. Then the Dream Theater's not going to be noticed at the Grammys, so you just wonder who it's for.
Yeah.
It's clearly for themselves, but I just think it's such a weird...
It's like
Are they going to listen back to it and be like, yeah...
an
this is
attempt at,
good.
like, artifice or something, you know.
It's just this weird sober delusion. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. One thing I do want to ask though is do Dream Theater fans and Queensryche fans get along?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I get that feeling. Like in the world of prog metal, you're either a Dream Theater guy or a Queensryche.
Well, you're into the European stuff like Opeth.
Sure.
Well, Dream Theater fans are more like Rush fans, whereas Queensryche fans are more like Maiden fans.
Okay.
Whereas, like, I think Maiden fans don't really get into Dream Theater, and whereas, like, Dream Theater's like the Rush fans get into, like, then the prog metal bands, but not bands like Maiden.
Okay.
I don't know about Opeth. Opeth are a little death metal-y, so, like, I think some people who don't get into Opeth.
Yeah, well,
I've never been a big Opeth fan,
Queensryche are a
personally.
New York band as well, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so
I've
they're
never been a Queensryche fan, personally.
but they're an American prog metal band, whereas Opeth, where are they from? Like Sweden or something?
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Yeah. So, the European metal and prog metal is always a bit different.
Yeah. But now we get to the title track, the 8th track, Octavarium. If this was the only track on the album, and it's just a 24-minute release, I still think this is one of the better things Dream Theater put out. This is like an encapsulation of what I like about the band, but also even James LaBrie's voice gets a bit annoying, but I like the idea of the song.
And the intro drone is like beautiful.
Yeah, it's Fripp-esque, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very, very good drone. And yeah, no, the song as well has touches of all these. Like it even goes into like prog folky territory, almost like Genesis.
Yeah. And the lyrics quote, all these Beatles and Yes. And
Yeah, I heard Lucy
King
in the
Crimson
Sky and
songs,
something
Machine
else.
Messiah,
Yeah.
things like that. And one thing I wanted to say about the guitarist of the group, John Petrucci, for all his like technical finesse, which is shown off on this album and others, when he's doing straight ahead riffs, he's almost better than like most metal guitarists. It sounds like they're the best of Mastodon or some of these like Electric Wizard groups that we like, kind of sludgy groups that we like.
Yeah, no, the rhythm guitar actually has a good like sort of
Good tone,
chunk to it as well.
Yeah.
Sort of very visceral. Where potentially, they could have stuck to that rather than just going into the more intricate parts. But I suppose it's because Portnoy is kind of like the main guy, right?
Yeah.
And he wants to do weird percussive things. But yeah, the guitarist, it would work in most metal bands, definitely.
Yeah, like for a guy known for technical soloing, his riffs are in that sort of more straightforward, traditional metal sense are really awesome, I think. But yeah, no, I just... This is my way of discussing Dream Theater on Mandala, and I mean, I'll just discuss the albums afterward, like, just briefly, because I think they do go in more of a direction of just doing straight up proggy sort of songs, and then there'll be one of these ballady songs on the album. 2007, Systematic Chaos, and Black Clouds and Silver Lining, I would consider examples of this, and then Black Clouds and Silver Lining is the last one of Portnoy. Then they got a different drummer named Mike Mangini, but their sound pretty much stayed the same to my ears. I mean, maybe if Portnoy was there, they would change their sound up a little bit more, actually, is the impression I get.
Sure.
But I think Portnoy's back with them, but they haven't put out an album yet. They're probably just going to go on tour for a bit.
Okay.
But then they...
I didn't realise you got back together with...
Yeah, it was quite recently.
Okay.
But yeah, with Mangini, they did a dramatic turn of events, which I quite like. Self-titled in 2013 and The Astonishing in 2016, both of which are crap. I don't like them, and people hate The Astonishing in particular.
Oh, wow.
They don't like this self-titled much either, though, of course. Then the two where they did after that were Distance Over Time in 2019 and A View from the Top of the World 2021. I think those are both pretty good. Like, listen, when Dream Theater are just doing their formula, like what Rush are doing on 2007 Snakes and Arrows, it's really good. And these are Rush on Snakes and Arrows. I get the feeling that that's what they... It wasn't like a formula. That's what they wanted to do.
Sure,
So,
yeah.
like, it's not really formulaic, but, like, when they're
What's
doing...
their formula?
Yeah, when they're doing their shtick, they're great. When they try to, like, branch out a bit... Like, look, that's not the kind of music they listen to, so they don't know how to compose it.
That's sort of what I was trying to say.
That's exactly what you were saying. I'm reiterating it. Yeah. It just is what it is. But I like the idea of this group, this kind of metal Rush, and I love Rush and the movements of Rush over their discography. And Dream Theater are like the more metal version of that. And another group, which I might talk about in future, are the more proggier, lighter version of Rush, and they're called Marillion.
Marillion. Scotland.
Yeah, Fesh, and then Steve Hogarth, but no, that's for another day. But that's
childhood.
No, that's my take on Dream Theater. Like, listen, like it's corny cheese. This is it's more complex than Dio, but I have to justify it on the same terms as listening to Dio. It is what it is. Like, after Associates, Wire, Dogball, fucking Ryan Jonestown Massacre, John Hassel, but Dream Theater too.
Yeah. Well, Dream Theater, it exists in a sort of corridor of music.
Milk from Cheltenham. Dream Theater too.
Well, those are like groups that are more like they're based in music as a sort of art project, whereas Dream Theater is music as a technical endeavor.
Music nerd, music school. Yeah.
I guess the art endeavor that they're attaching themselves to is metal.
Yeah,
but
true.
therein lies the sort of the flaw.
The metal punk dichotomy that we kind of talk about a bit.
I suppose, because like metal is its own sort of like. I suppose maybe I always give the guy who made Metal Evolution shit.
Yeah.
But it is more an anthropological phenomenon, to be honest, than it is a musical phenomenon.
Yeah, it's a goofy, hyper-masculine sort of just like rush of people. Not pun not intended.
Sure, it exists as more of a like. I guess similar to hardcore punk as opposed to art punk.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
It's like meant to be this like primordial, like visceral sort of thing, which is maybe when a band like Dream Theater sort of tries to bring in art pretensions into metal, it can feel a bit wonky,
Yeah.
Whereas metal that's just trying to be like brutal or whatever, it suits the aesthetic and the sort of anthropological idea in a different way, right? Though there is plenty of metal. Or at least like classical musicians and like eclectic, interesting songwriters, as well as like say like with Motorhead, just like punky sort of like pioneers that exist in metal. But I guess the phenomenon itself is a bit more like a collective experience. Rather than like it didn't take punk long to go beyond that, right? Well, not go beyond that, but become something else. Sort of rather than existing in the present in a more visceral way, like punk is, pontificating on the past and the future.
Yeah.
Whereas metal only does that in a sort of fantastical way, like you were saying with World War II battles, or like I could imagine Dream Theater having a song about the Battle of Passchendaele,
Yeah, maybe
World
have
War
one.
I.
Yeah.
Do they?
Yeah, and like Dance of Death, Passchendaele.
Wow.
It's a good song. I like
There you
Dance of
go.
Death.
Holy shit. Yeah, no, see, that makes sense. Whereas
For a second, I was like, he's obviously referencing that.
No,
I
didn't know that exists. But I'm glad it does, because it sort of vindicates, I think, what I was saying. Whereas...
Yeah, I thought you were about to go, that's why I brought it up.
No. Whereas, like you said, once again, to reiterate with 9/11, it just doesn't work. Whereas... I don't know, there's some stupid ska band from that time.
You couldn't do it about a Vietnam thing either, I feel. Like, that's also a bit too much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Partly because that's like America, or because America being the aggressor, like, partly, yeah.
Yeah, unless it's like a veteran tribute,
Oh, yeah, like One by Metallica.
I suppose, yeah, One
I
is...
don't know, one doesn't work for me.
The problem with one is more musically, and conceptually it's a bit pretentious. It's in a similar
like
vein.
one of those guys.
No,
they're just exploiting like the veteran trope for like literally referencing the Johnny Got His Gun, a more sincere quote from the early 70s. And you're like, oh, we can do that too. That's like a thing that's considered like edgy and cool.
Or like For Whom the Bell Tolls. I'm like, oh, that's a cool title. So like the song's not even about the book, but it's like just the phrase.
They probably haven't read it, or maybe they started it in high school and just remember it.
Yeah, it's like a well-known
Some
title.
violent description in there. They're like, yeah, that's pretty metal.
But yeah, exactly. So metal operates in that level, whereas punk is trying to like be a bit more.
Honestly, like to be honest, like, and this being sound a bit pretentious, but like actually intellectual, sincerely, right?
Yeah, it's meant to be more heady rather than visceral. Even hardcore punk tried to be heady. That's where you get. That's where you get Minor Threat, right?
Henry Rollins, Giallo Biafra,
sort
these
of
are very well-spoken guys.
Exactly, and I think that's hardcore punk's, at least why I can appreciate it on an intellectual level a little bit more than metal, is sort of because it combines those two worlds. But that's also the same as, like, avant-garde experimental punk, like Milk from Cheltenham or This Heat.
Yeah.
It's doing the same thing as, like, Dead Kennedys, you know, or Minor Threat.
Yeah.
In a more musically interesting way as well.
Mm.
Less visceral, but just as visceral, but less traditional in its songs, you know.
Yeah.
And metal doesn't have much of that. There is like post metal. I haven't heard too much post metal outside of stuff like Sun O and
those are cool guys.
And there's seemingly there's some stuff in that world as well that is fairly, you know, takes the idea of metal or the aesthetic and I guess melds it with that sort of art punk thing. But like when metal bands try to have intellectual or artistic exercises, there's just always something that feels a bit off about it. So sometimes
juvenile and sort of just like they try to metalify everything. It's just like kind of dorky to me.
Yeah, whereas I don't know, where it sort of starts, something like Hawkwind feels a bit more legitimate. I guess it's still one foot in that 60s proto-punk world.
Yeah, and also like there was certain hippie fervor to be seriously intellectual as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I suppose what I'm getting at is like Steve Harris, the bassist of Iron Maiden. He just doesn't seem like the sort of guy that on the side of doing Iron Maiden would write like science fiction books or something, you know.
Not very good ones, at least.
Sure, yeah. Or maybe like some Conan the Barbarian ripoffs or something.
Oh yeah, maybe.
But yeah, nah. Otherwise than that riffing, this album is definitely you can get over, like you were saying, the sort of place it exists in, the time.
Yeah.
Then the expression of, I suppose that sort of like Genesis Duke thing is sort of you know, it does have that sort of like pathology to it.
Yeah.
Which is interesting at the very least.
Yeah. Mentioning punk before, maybe we'll discuss how like some punk operates in Australia over the 2010s.
Yeah. Going to the next one. Yeah, Royal Headache. This is a Live in America album. A recent release.
Yeah, very recent.
I suppose I picked it just because, it was really recent. And it was on my mind even because I was in the car with my mother a few weeks back and she has like the local radio set on. And they were playing one of the tracks off this as like an upcoming promo.
Yeah.
And I was just like, man, it's kind of nuts that they're still playing Royal Headache on the radio.
Yeah, that surprises me.
Because, I guess I picked this one just because it's in the sort of ether at the moment. And just to sort of highlight the band's, earlier work, because they're a sort of short-lived band from Sydney that had a brief moment of, this recordings of a small tour of America. I think infamously, even the people like Pitchfork and Anthony Fantano reviewed this album.
Oh, Anthony Fantano. I don't think I'm allowed to like this one, guys. I can't really put it in like a trendy, fucking cliquey narrative because I'm a piece of shit with no work as a human being.
I remember flicking through. It's one of the only videos of his that I ever even flicked through, and he's just underplaying. I think it was the second album he reviewed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was just underplaying its sort of interesting qualities. He was saying, and then at the end he's just it's like a strong 6 or light 7. And I'm like, man, I can't believe people watch this show. Like, just listen to the music he reviews. Don't even watch his videos, you know? But that's that.
He wants to, like, listen to a guy's head, like, that up close.
Yeah, and, like, lame, mean vaporwave jokes
This
and
is
stuff.
just, like, weird, like, Phil Collins-y creepy cult, and I have no time for it.
Sure. So, yeah, this was a band from Sydney, from this local scene that was briefly on the verge of, like, getting indie cred in America or whatever, which sort of fascinates me, but you can understand why, because, like, they're a very good band, and they have a new take on that sort of, I don't know, the wedding present, sort of like, you know, ramshackle jangle style that, I guess Ned's Atomic Dustbin were trying to rip off.
Ha!
But, anyway, it's this ramshackling, like, punky jangle sort of songs that are, like, instrumentals that are mixed in with these weird, short little, most of the songs are maybe, like, 2.5 minutes long.
Yeah.
And they're strange, like, soul ditties that, like, the singer, this guy called Shogun, has a very particular voice, and especially the first album is produced in a very particular way, where it sounds like it's this, like, sort of AM radio that's playing, like, Smokey and the Robinson, or, like, early, like, Michael Jackson as a kid sort of songs, and it just has that weird sort of, like, high-pitched, soulful sort of swooning quality to it. And so it's such a weird juxtaposition to put over this, like, ramshackle punk music, and it's sort of that weird alchemical process created a rare case in, like, post-punk revival music where it's a sort of new idea, right? Well, there's a new paradigm to the sort of the components, right? There's a new way of constructing a sound, and so it makes a lot of sense that this band were right on the verge of really sort of taking off. But I guess they just sort of ended too soon. Only had 2 albums that are both, like, of high quality, and an EP from before. But I just I love listening to this album a few times since it's been released, like a couple of days ago, I guess. Because it's just I never got to see this band live in the sort of setting that I guess the first few recordings are on a radio station, but then the next few are at a club. And it really feels like you're in the club listening to them play. And the only time I ever saw them was one of their last gigs at, like, a free open-air concert that the Flaming Lips, of all bands, were headlining.
Yeah.
And I was just like, man, I was more... I went because Royal Headache were playing, but for Flaming Lips. That's how much I liked them at the time. And, yeah, it's a shame I only ever get to saw them in the open-air setting. Just didn't capture the sound of the band as well as it would have in, like, you know, a sort of small club where it's reverberating around the walls and the crowd and stuff. And I guess I appreciate this new release because it captures that from a band I already really like, but they're able to sort of put out a fairly decent quality official live release some, I don't know, like 8 years or so after they've disbanded. And yeah, it just shows that, like, there was a real energy to at least that scene, that the sort of band that became the most preeminent group in that whole thing have a sort of legitimate case for their sort of placing in the post-punk revival world from such modest beginnings, right? Like, this album would start off with, like, oh, this band's all the way from Sydney, Australia.
Yeah.
And that just sort of tells the whole thing, right? Right off the bat. And yeah. So that's sort of why I really wanted to talk about this one, and I guess Royal Headache in general. Some of the best songs ever as well. Like, yeah, both albums are full of amazing songs. I could just name them all, but in particular, there's songs like Down the Lane, which is just like almost like alternative rock epic. Sneaky, quiet, like, if they had to put that on C86, that old NME thing, that would have headlined the whole tape.
Nice, yeah.
But yeah, that's sort of this band. They're definitely worthy of that tradition, and a great sort of more contemporaneous, like, addition to.
Yeah, I like Royal Headache, and they're good at composing these very catchy, short and immediate, tempo changing occasionally, you know, guitar oriented, punk inspired numbers. But the difference is, like, their vocalist is very it's very asserted in the mix, and it's very you know, in the live context certainly as well. You know, the mix matches how it is live, as you see here on this particular set of recordings, and the clarity of the vocals is what, in the music and the recordings, is what sets it apart from, I think, some of the other bands in the scene who have more of a growly sort of punk sound, which sort of like, you didn't hear every word, and that wasn't the point though. Whereas you can hear a lot of you can hear watch the words, generally speaking, that Shogun is saying.
Yeah.
If you're trying to listen anyway, and if you can't, it's just because this is a live recording, or maybe the second half, but is what it is. But but I do really like the group, and sometimes I'd feel a bit jaded with this sort of Sydney scene, just because I felt like a bit like the I kind of mentioned about the Jonestown Dandy Warhols thing a little bit earlier. Sometimes I felt as though, like, of all the things we can do and of all the things we have access to, the fact that these groups are just doing this sort of thing just felt a bit like wasted to me. But they made good examples of the music. It was kind of nihilistic and sort of like sometimes in respect I felt like it was unambitious, but like there was creative within those paradigms. But one of the songs on here is subtly it sounds like, I think it's kind of old. It's the same melodies and old. The Sonics are different, just because different sort of band, but it's the same melodies and old. I think it's an old early Cure song. Yeah, I could be wrong. I was like, it's like the dude or whatever it was.
Which track?
We'd have to go through it again.
Okay.
I'm not as I've heard the first. Yeah, I'm not as overly familiar with I haven't heard the first two albums in full since like 2016 or something. I like those albums. I like the first one a little bit more, actually.
Oh, the first one's the best one, yeah.
High's production's a bit more polished, maybe that's why I don't like it as much.
It's
just dichotomy there. I think production ought to fit the music's character, and I don't think lo-fi production means it's like hard to hear or like hard on the ears, you know what I mean? It's just sort of there's a tasteful way of making lo-fi music sound palatable to an ear, and then it's not just a demo. It doesn't just sound like a fucking demo recording. You know what I mean? There's a huge difference.
Sure.
So
like Nuclear Submarine Captain.
Yeah, like when we say lo-fi recording and like things sound better and they sound bad, we don't really mean like demo recording. We just mean like, or maybe if it's like a certain sort of band, but like like sometimes if it sounds too clean, it doesn't sound real. It doesn't sound like you've captured the sound of the band.
Sure.
You know what I mean? You know what I mean? You've done something different. You've transformed it into something else anyway.
Yeah, well, the first album definitely sounds more like, say, this recording than the second album does.
Yeah. It sounds like everyone's recorded separately, sort of thing. And,
yeah, definitely.
But Royal Headache. That's my only thing. Is I guess sometimes.
So because I guess the nature of just the songs, like there are a few songs on that second album that are like some of the best songs. Like one of the last songs is called Little Star, and I'm like, man.
Oh yeah, that's the last track on here.
Yeah, it's like a genius song. It's like that would be considered like a soul classic if it was from back in the day.
No, they're cool, and I mean, I guess I like bands with more electronics and sort of like out there imaginations and sort of living in the material, sort of just like fuck it sort of lifestyle, and that's all well and good, but it's just I guess I just am in a slightly different world / generation. These guys are like 7 years older than me at least. It is what it is. But no, it's a good release, and I do give I'm fun. Royal Headache pretty cool. Yeah, I say.
Yeah. Sick little group.
Now I shall move on to a group which I visited before on this program. I visited programs more than once before. Certainly Ultravox, I did that, like the show after, Lament after
Vox.
Rage and Eden. I did Presto, a couple of shows after discussing Grace Under Pressure. And now some shows after Real to Real Cacophony. Is this the age of Empires and Dance? I hinted in that show that like I was talking about Empires and Dance enough when talking about Real to Real Cacophony, but I figured, okay, we've got to talk about Empires and Dance eventually. Here's the thing, there's a few claims / statements opinions I have about this album. I feel like these guys weren't geniuses, as a result they delivered a genius album. John Leckie was a genius producer, so that certainly helps.
Yeah, that helps, yeah.
Works with Magazine and some other really cool groups. But I mean, his what I love about...
Didn't he do the first?
John Leckie.
Yeah.
He did the first 3 albums of Simple Minds, yeah.
The first, sorry.
First, I think it was Steal It for Lily White.
Oh, okay. Well, was John Leckie the Stone Roses?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
No, he did XTC a few times as well.
Yeah. No, he's got his fingertips all over that era, yeah, definitely.
So clearly an interesting, potentially vital factor. But Empires and Dance, it reminds how fascinating that an album reminds me of being 18 when I was 8 reminds me of when I was 18/19. Yeah, I didn't listen to it when I was 18/19. It's not like, albums like, just considering the kind of stuff I listened to when I was 18/19, albums like Uncle Meat or Joe's Garage or Aja or Gaucho, the kinds of things that make me think of when I was that age. I was listening to when I was 18/19, as you do when you're 18/19, I would guess. But no, Empires and Dance makes me think of being a first year university student who wants to potentially write poetry or contribute to a canon of English discourse, and like despite knowing, as far as despite not really, not my very not understanding, knowing very little about the grand scheme of things, and like having no real nuance, no significant nuance in my opinions or views on it, and like where I'm going to distinguish myself, and how I'm going to like my viewpoint. And that's kind of like Jim Kerr's coming out with his lyrical position on this record. And musically, it's aping off of all the big, Kraftwerk, Gary Newman, Joy Division, all the big groups around that, Moroder, all the big groups around that time, Sparks and Moroder.
Yeah, Sparks definitely, yeah.
And it's
and somewhat like High Energy even.
Yeah.
Like, I wonder if they heard like Sylvester.
They definitely did. They're in Europe, touring.
Yeah.
This is their European album. As we quoted James Dean Bradfield of the Manic Street Preachers when he's talking about this album, how these guys are from Scotland, but they wanted to be like European. They wanted to eschew that. And stuff like that. The album just reeks of this, and I love that about it.
And a strange juxtaposition of like I guess similar to the John Hassel thing of like this, what was it, fourth world music?
Yeah.
Where the title of this album being Empires and Dance. So you get the weird the juxtaposition of empire, right? This sort of hyper civilized form of social cohesion.
Yeah, and seemingly
dance,
archaic, right? At that point in time, like it evokes images of a previous century.
Yeah, or like the collapse of empires in after the First World War. You get the impression of, because like you said, this album feels like he's trying to be European, or like the Manic Street Preachers guy said. Because this sort of feels like that, the end of monarchy, at the, concluding the First World War. And then mixed with the, I guess juxtaposed to dance, which is, I guess, more like a sort of tribal thing. And the sort of, the high energy, almost like disco sounds of the album are almost trying to be like tribal, and that sort of, primordial rhythm, percussive sense, like it's a ritual or something. And these clubs are rituals or whatever.
Yeah, almost like kind of celebrating or kind of like worshipping the coming of the end of the world as the great bomb comes to deliver us to heaven. It's such a fascinating like subconscious cycle being carried out there. And there's so much. It's such a fascinating point in time, such a beautifully distinct pathology distilled on Empires and Dance, and I just think the tracks are superlative. Like, I love I Travel. Today I Died Again is so brilliant and haunting. Sometimes I wonder, like, how you get to realize how genius this album is when you're going around a city at night listening to this on like your headphones or your earphones or whichever. You realize like this, where they were coming from, and how the music and the lyrics come together more perfectly than almost any other album I can think of. And it celebrates a bit more basic, but I still love it, and it's catchy as heck. This Fear of Gods is, I mean, my goodness, one of the best things they ever did. Singing in the shower, someone's singing in the shower. And some of the lyrics are just, on their own, they're not good, but in conjunction with the music, they sound so brilliant, and they're such cliche, poetic, claptrap, like, the clothes he wears bring back to the war. She can remember his wife's special name. Like, as poetry, it's such hackneyed crap.
Oh,
but, like, with the music, it's so cool.
They're all trying to imitate
British Depression. It's so good.
And they're all trying to imitate, like,
Ian
Curtis. Bowie. I was going to say Eno, but more so...
Ian Curtis?
Even Ian Curtis.
Who can't remember?
It's all downstream of, all these Bowie songs that have these weird, like, The idea is like Bowie lyrics are surreal and don't make sense in a literal sense most of the time it's meant to be these little picturesque things that evoke a sort of emotion, similar to like I said, Eno. You know, the whole idea of what's his lateral thinking like card game.
How do I not know this?
I forget what it's called, but you know.
Oblique Strategies.
Yeah, Oblique Strategies. It's all these sort of songwriters like the ones you mentioned and Jim Kerr are trying to write lyrics that it's not literal, you know. It's more in that like modernist data, oblique strategy sort of thing, you know. Like a Brian Eno lyric. Like he has say a song on the first album about the D-Day landing or whatever. What's it called? You know the one.
On Some Faraway Beach.
On Some Faraway Beach, yeah. And it's like, it is this literal song in the like classical pop sense, but it's done within just these vignettes of imagery, which is sort of what this album does as well. It's like all the concept and thematics come from vignettes of imagery rather than literal poetics.
Yeah, or narrative.
'Cause
yeah.
literal poetics don't suit like dance music.
No, true.
It suits like singer-songwriter folk music or stuff like that, you know. Whereas dance music, you need this sort of thing, you know, or punk, or various other more like danceable rock, you know, even.
Yeah. God, and gotta love this Fear of God. I love the outro to that where they're just it kind of becomes gibberish after just kind of yelping. Fear of God. And then Capital City is the one which you've pointed out before. Sounds a bit like Autobahn by Kraftwerk.
It does sound like Autobahn.
So does the Dazzle Ships song. There's that track on Dazzle Ships by OMD which sounds like Neon Lights off of the Man Machine. So like whatever, they all did it. They all ripped off a Kraftwerk song by accident.
Yeah, well, more consciously on the case of OMD because they were like the uber Kraftwerk fans. Their whole like thing was based off Kraftwerk essentially.
Gary Newman's whole thing was based off of one Kraftwerk album.
Yeah.
You said that in the previous show.
Yeah.
No, just Gary. Well, kind of. What?
He just saw a keyboard in the studio.
Well, yeah.
I want to do that now.
But you know, like the Capital City is similar to Autobahn, but I do really like Capital City.
Well, no, it's a good song.
And then the next 5 tracks is like the best last. I said that about Psychic TV to the Infinite Acid, to the Acid Infinity, however you order those words. The album's title is.
Yeah.
And it's Horror House, Jigsaw, Alien Bee, and Stick Insect, and Money for E is like the best final tracks ever.
Beyond the Infinite Beat.
Yeah. But the other best final 5 tracks ever is Constantinople Line, Twist, Run, Repulsion, 30 Frames a Second, Can't Kino, and Room. Constantinople Line, I mean, it's one of the best songs of the whole era. Hey waiter, what soup is this? Do. That's do. Fuck, that's so genius. Like that's beyond their abilities. And then so is Twist, Run, Repulsion. Talk. Laughing at Marie, and Marie laughs back. That's so fucking good. And then 30 Frames a Second. That's so innovative and interesting. Can't Kino has some of the most beautiful. You almost wish that was an intro to an even more beautiful song, but how could anything be more beautiful than that? Just that minute 50 seconds of Can't Kino. What a guitar tone. Charlie Burke was really good. And then Room, like one of the only lyrics of the song. I think the only in your room. That's like the formula which they turned into a crappy single later on for the Breakfast Club, and is like a lot of tracks from Sparkle in the Rain kind of extrapolate on that too. But like Room is such a beautiful little like minimal ditty. I mean, they were good beyond their means, and
it's a shame that the Simple Minds and the Furs, Psychedelic Furs, fell into the John Hughes trap. So did OMD. Damn it. Yeah, these cool bands. I'm sure Echo and the Bunnymen have a John Hughes song. Such a weird world, eh?
Yeah.
But one shout out to one of these sort of, I guess, downstream of Eno Bowie like synth pop songs on Systems of Romance, the Ultravox album, has that song called Dislocation. That's similar to songs on this album.
Yeah.
I'm like, man, what the hell is that? It's a weird like rich area for like these strange obscure pop songs, the whole early synth pop movement. And yeah, this album's like kind of indicative of the whole movement in a way.
Yeah.
It's It's like if the Human League's second album was actually a good album. It's like this album.
I think it's one of the best things of the whole era. Like I come back to it. It's takes you there, and it's immediately and still infectious today, both as a distinct product of its time and something that reminds you of modern sensibilities, which have still seen use and fit in popular mainstream music. It's masterly, in my view. Absolutely love this thing. Anything else to share about Empires and Dance?
No, I'll give it a listen.
Yeah, we discussed Simple Minds so much when we did Real True Cacophony, so I feel like I got a lot of the other auxiliary thoughts about the group out there.
Yeah.
Just Empires and Dance just reminds me of when I'm taking buses to and from university, trying to make my own contributions to a canon that includes the likes of John Keats to in weird fiction like China Meeville later on. Like just trying to reconcile it all. Like how do you do it? Because the canon keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the whole world which is supposed to pay attention to is bigger and bigger, and the discourse, English language contributions, crazy.
In fact, the canon's getting so big that it's almost like French science fiction. You know how they would theorize that you could shoot from Earth to the moon through a giant cannon in the classic Jules Verne tale, right?
Yeah, of course.
Which to tie into Energy 2000 also was apparently based in like Florida. So somehow Jules Verne knew where they were going to launch the actual Earth moon thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you'll permit me, in the vein of French science fiction,
Yeah, Metal Hurlant. Let's go.
I will completely butcher the pronunciation of both this guy and the album's name because I don't know how to pronounce it, but I assume it's Dominique Gué or Guo. I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
Guillaume?
Yeah, it's some French name. And the album's L'Univers de l'amour.
Yeah.
It's an album from, I think, 79?
8.
8, yeah. And it's, I guess an album I came across through an earlier form of, just YouTube recommendation. And it's similar to, what's it called? The, Music for Plants. By
Mort Garson?
Yeah, by Mort Garson. It's like, along with that album, this is the sort of album that first introduced me to even what library music was.
Yeah.
And I was just remembering last week he had a couple like library music and also like progressive electronic albums. Yeah. And it sort of got me to reminisce on first getting into both that Mort Garson album.
Yeah.
And this album, which is some of like the freakiest like science fiction, like moog exploitation, progressive electronic shit I ever heard. Like, I don't know what this guy was thinking at the time, but it just seems like it's a strange like studio experiment, that perhaps was meant to score like Metal Hurlant adaptations, animations for television, or like what's that French sci-fi movie again?
Oh, Fantastic Planet.
Yeah, like Fantastic Planet or like Gandahar or something like that.
Yeah, one of René Laloux's features.
Yeah, even the album cover looks like the Fantastic Planet aliens.
Yeah.
In a weird way. There are all these strange like the first track's like I don't even know what you call that, like an ethereal sort of synth ballad, and then the second track's like a, what do they call it? Not Dungeon House.
Dungeon Synth?
Dungeon Synth. Yeah, it's like a Dungeon Synth song.
Diplodocus. That's some good music, yeah.
And
Tolkien Dungeon Synth.
Tolkien.
There's bands for like Mirkwood and stuff. They're so cool.
Because I feel like Dungeon Synth and stuff like that is almost aping off like old obscure library music, but it's a case of, I guess, it happening sort of like contemporaneously, and then you get these like sort of folk proggy songs, like things that almost sound like it was done by what's the name of the guy from the Trespass era Genesis?
Anthony Phillips.
Yeah, like some sort of Anthony Phillips like psych prog or something, and yeah, you get these strange like similar to sort of synthesis like weird like dancey progressive songs. There's just sort of consistent variety to this album, and it's like all synth experiments that sort of has this cohesive idea of like a sort of cosmic surrealism that is like it sort of like feels removed from space and time in the way that like a psychedelic experience would say.
Yeah.
Where it's like it sort of embodies like a perspective that's like outside your own sort of perception, right? And it's weird that this sort of fairly basic electronic library music can do that. And like for something that seems like it was like it feels like it's in the world of like, you know, these 70s like progressive rock concept albums or whatever, like Yes or something, right? But it's just done in such a modest way that it's just a bit more subtle, you know, and it's like it's looking to be sort of listened to over and over again, and not as like say explicit, like the best example of like say a prog concept album doing that is like say Tarkus, where you have the album and it's got the whole story that's on the inside of it.
Sure, yeah.
Or even like in the sci-fi sense, one that's probably a bit closer because it's sort of symphonic as well. The War of the Worlds album from the late 70s.
Yeah.
Is a bit like that as well, you know. You sort of you meant to read along with the booklet and stuff like that. Whereas this is like 1 foot in that world and 1 foot in the more experiential, you know, like ambient world or whatever. And yeah, it's just a strange album that I kind of appreciate because it was a gateway into that whole weird and wonderful world of like library and progressive electronic music.
Yeah, I really like this album, and it's very indicative of that moment in time, very kind of conscious soundtrack music to just stories in your imagination, not to anything specific, but just kind of vague stories which you can match up to vague Jungian cycles which you can match to any setting in your mind.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Yeah.
And it's good like that, and it's similar to, you know, there's French acts and albums which of this time which I do, not to take anything away from this, but I kind of tend to prefer, you know, Bernard Fevre, Space Art, and of course the famous Jean-Michel Jarre.
Oh yeah, those are all great, but those are different sort of things. They're not library music.
No, that's very... One of Fevre's releases, Cosmos 2033.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah.
Actually, both of them arguably are. Fevre... Excuse me. Fevre almost certainly is kind of... That Strange World of, I think that's his... That label, that cover art, that's shared by like a number of different recordings, releases from the label.
Yeah, no, Fevre is as opposed to Space Art. And
Space Art was more, a consciously sort of
but yeah,
arty. There's like the Space Disco, and I think Space Art's kind of the more experimental, roxy alternative to that almost. Or like, because that's duo, right? It's a bit like Suicide or DNF.
Yeah.
Like silly Daft Punk later.
Yeah.
And then Jean-Michel Jarre, yeah, it's about like Tangerine Dream or something.
Sure.
And
Yeah, Fevre's definitely very good.
Yeah, I was just gonna it's really good stuff. It's distinct from the German electronic music, was more experimental and sort of like proto-industrial, whereas I think some of this French stuff is more cosmic, and it's interested in sort of like going outside, because like the French are an interesting place. The French embraced nuclear technology, and so they had an interesting place in the Cold War, and they kind of just scooting through, imagining like a future beyond sort of class issues and strife and societal conflict, which, you know, that's just, if you ever turn on the news and like what's happening in France, you know, protests and attacking police in France.
Cars
today.
are being turned over.
Yeah, just there's always just angry people in France. You know, you have an image of lovely Paris, but really it's just everyone just cranky all the time. At least in the major like kind of metropolitan centres, it's always just like protesting about some new law or something.
Sure, yeah.
Because they're the French. They're very proud. They have a great pride. They're great passion for their civic rights, and they will punch up if the law enforcement's for that. Anyway, but so they're very ambitious, sort of interesting people. I tend to admire the French. Their cinema certainly, and their music is very interesting. And I think some of the if I'm going to sample any just random number of compositions of classical composers and listen to them, I don't normally listen to classical music. I think I'll go for like the French composers, particularly of the Rococo era. There's a certain shameless optimism about a lot of that stuff. Shameless optimism, which that shameless optimism of that aristocracy was not great for a lot of people in France, but we can enjoy it in posterity and in our own rental servitude, wage slavery, and we can enjoy what the peasants weren't able to enjoy whilst being peasants. It's interesting. No, seriously, it's a really good release.
Protesting all the time.
Yeah, it's a fascinating existence. Dominique was born in 1950, and so he's 28-ish when this album's released. He must have gotten a job within one of these studios or like library music. You start your way up as an, I don't know, little tape operator, and then you're working your way up here. I'm not sure how you get, but and then he's got quite a few releases, or 11, up to 2019. I don't know much else about them, although this is the only recording he put out during the 70s. Yeah, there's this sort of music, very interesting, highly compelling, the kind of music where, like space art, they're shorter tracks generally, actually shorter tracks even than maybe on space. The average length on here is like 2.5 minutes.
Yeah.
And so same Bernard Favre, and so to those of you who are more like complain of like longer songs and such like that, this one's more to their liking, I feel, rather than just something that meanders and tries to take you on an odyssey every time.
No, it's very immediate. That's true, and given that each song's about 2.5 minutes long, I guess it's similar to something like Moondog, where he can do that too.
Good point.
They're like contained odysseys, I suppose. And like you said, key to it is the sort of like, cosmic sort of thing it's going for. Obviously it's shown on the album cover, this very like cosmic thing. But the sort of layering and harmonies of all the like analog synthesizers is sort of the key enjoyable aspect of this album. The compositions are fairly interesting as well, but there's just it captures the charm of like right at the end of the analog synthesizer age, right? Like, earlier where you were describing, where eventually by the mid-80s, synthesizers become like MIDI music or whatever.
Yes.
And they lose, it's digital, and it sort of loses that, the mechanical aspects of analog synths. And it's captured just so beautifully, I feel, on this album. And the first track is a perfect example of that.
You know what it also is? It's a time when, think about science fiction in any medium prior to Star Wars in 1977. It's closer to Metal Hurlant in all like British science fiction authors are people like Ballard and Moorcock, and then authors like in the magazines in America like Lafferty or Brana, or Brana was English, or Philip K. Dick's in most interesting kind of out there work around this time. Just any number of legacy acts like Heinlein, Asimov, and Bradbury still doing their thing. Clarke still doing his thing. 2001 is not 10 years old yet, even, and science fiction pre-Star Wars, the place that it's in before science fiction became a series of space operas in the popular imagination, when it was something more trippy, like even though Dune's like a Jungian cycle, it's trippy as all hell.
Sure,
and that kind of openly psychedelic, or like inspired by that sort of prose in parts in the second half of the text. And so what you have in the Dominique Guyot release is it's a window into that sort of world where the electronic music was matching the science fiction, because Star Wars has the orchestral symphonic soundtrack.
Slash disco.
For the spin-off releases.
Or
for Lapti Nek in Jedi.
No, for like people doing disco remixes.
I kind of was
the year that song was like the year the album.
The Lepco or whatever it's called. Yeah.
There's a few of them. Like
Nico.
I uploaded some random space disco thing. 2 of them two different space disco albums from 77 to 78 have it on. Like, there's so many people covered the Star Wars theme in disco. It's weird.
But the disco thing was distinct as well, though. Like another, almost like a conjunction of Star Wars in a funny way. But it's interesting how like Star Wars, and especially like by Empire and Jedi, really changed everyone's idea of science fiction into a very kind of standardized conception. And it's a bit like how the music that matched those films, even when it was electronic, became very standardized, sort of hollowed out, I feel. But it is look, it is what it is. And because I like those science fiction films that came out prior to Star Wars, like I like the, George Lucas himself, THX, Terminal Man, Phase 4, and then around the world you had things like World on a Wire and Solaris. What's that other one I'm thinking of? I can't remember the name of.
Yeah, early 70s sci-fi has some classics in there.
Yeah. God, there's good ones out there. There's, obviously Clockwork Orange. Even stuff like Soylent Green, Westworld, from America.
Yeah, even a few of the like sort of more pulpy ones are kind of enjoyable, like Soylent Green.
That's good stuff, actually. Yeah. But hey, a good album here, and check this out and all the other stuff that we were talking about as well during this particular round. And I suppose I'm going to close this off here by talking about the brothers Eno, Brian and Roger.
Yeah, the secret Roger. Genius the whole time was actually Roger, it turns out.
Even though Roger was born like 10 years after Eno was.
Yeah, he was a child prodigy like Mozart, and sort of Brian Eno just took the cover so he could sign a record contract when he was 20 years old. And secretly in the background, Roger was doing all the work the whole time.
Yeah, it's funny. Roger's got like quite a long solo career of his own. He's got albums out since 1988, and I'm sadly not as familiar with it as with Brian's, his older brothers.
Yeah, neither.
I don't know to what degree who does what necessarily on this album, but it's a kind of ambient music that's closer to the ambient 2, which is the one of Howard Budd, where it's based around series of piano notes and chords rather than kind of longer keys or drones.
Sure. Well, it's a bit like the second with the consistent sort of like, well, not consistent, but more melodic piano, but also like the first one as well. Well, it's a bit more minimal than the Harold Budd, I suppose. This album, I felt like it should have been like called Music for Airports 2, Lockdown at Heathrow or something.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it reminded me a bit of that, because how like with the first one, the sort of, it reminded me of this, where like a melody will start to form, but then just as you think something's like a pattern's about to shape up, it sort of dissipates into something else. It's sort of fluid in that sense.
Okay. Because obviously ambient one, the Airports, they're like much longer compositions. So these are 4-minute tracks.
No, this is just like quite a few, like probably 18 long, 4-minute tracks. Yeah. It's a bit more but even then, like they could have
background noise in ambient one as well, right?
Yeah. But like I suppose this one is a bit more cut up as opposed to being one more like longer compositions, but the compositions are so of the same ilk that it almost feels like they were all composed simultaneously with the same philosophy. So it really is just like that one long composition cut up, maybe even arbitrarily, into bits. You'd have to ask them. If I was interviewing them, I would ask them, how did you compose this, obviously.
Yeah.
But, like, it's almost fluid in that way as well, where you don't know where they cut the lines or where the conversation started and ended. It almost feels as though they would have made them all at once,
Yeah, I feel like this is a kind of album which brings Eno's kind of popularly understood musical philosophy of that ambient ethos, and even the genre in general, insofar as it's mostly taken from Eno in many respects, kind of brings it a little bit full circle into reasserting its relevance and I guess purpose / function in a contemporary, or just timeless context, because Well, when the ambient series was new, this was an experimental genre, and the purpose of the genre is very obvious and immediate. And now, the kind of creator slash pioneer of it has come full circle, try and perfect it. Seemingly, him and his younger brother getting together, seemingly just trying to compose something that made them, try. I can only imagine what would make these guys feel as though, like, yep, this is a sound work, this is good by us. The guys who made the genre themselves, like, what's going to make them satisfied, what's going to gratify them, and so, I think the result here is something that reasserts my interest um, in this genre, this world that he's developed. It is similar to the earlier work. It takes kind of the best properties of those albums and first two ambient in that 4-part series, and places it on here in it's almost one of its best applied projects. I would say, and it's an interesting case for that sort of piano based, classically music inclined, though not in a formal sense, in a more like it's interesting how the notes on here are accentuated by things like pitch, time, echo, and they're not things which you can. I suppose you can, but they're more lent to electronic production rather than sort of and alteration rather than a sort of formal like sheet music rules.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's still a very kind of interesting and psychologically inclined area rather than one that's kind of fulfilling a more quasi-mathematical attempt at sequencing and programming, which we could call more formal music tradition.
Well, it's more like the album title suggests. It's a mixing of colours, like say when you have a palette, you're painting something, and you got to mix two colours together. So it's a blending of, I guess, the two brothers' stylings, right? Because I suppose Rodrino is like a pianist.
Oh, sure.
So that's where all that's coming from. And then under all his sort of like you said, they're not, you can't like necessarily like write them down in the classical sense or notate them in a mathematical sense. It's a bit more fluid, and it weaves in with like Brian Eno's all the drones and ambience across the album, and it's weird how like both those mix in such a natural way. Like if you listen closely, the album's full of like beautiful drones, right?
Yeah.
Which is clearly what Brian's doing.
Yeah.
And then the way these like dissipating melodies like come and go, mixes in with that in such a incalculable way, right? So yeah, it's definitely like veterans and like you said, if not like creators of the genre, the people who conceptually, formed it, right?
Yeah.
And taxonomically named it,
Yes.
at the very least. And yeah, it feels like veterans of that really accomplishing, sort of, yeah, it's like what artists, especially outside of the world of completely, like, adolescent-centric popular music, which is all about commercialism predominantly, right? Whereas this is a pure, like, artist actually, their life and the work along the way encapsulates a sort of growth, right?
Yeah.
Whereas artists who get caught in the sort of more adolescent world tend to have that, like, oh, I like your old music better than your new music,
Yeah.
They get sort of caught in that paradigm where, as they age, they're not progressing as artists naturally, right?
Yeah.
Whereas someone like the Eno brothers do feel like they actually embody that pure artist sort of life,
Definitely, yeah, I agree that, yeah. This is another in a stew of classics from Brian Eno's discography, quite possibly the most interesting of all discographies. I mean, I think you get major classics, more than one, in each decade. Like, obviously in the 70s we can point to the likes of Taking Tiger Mountain, Another Green World, Before and After Science, Ambient One. There's also collaborations with artists like Fripp, No Pussyfooting, and Evening Star, and Cluster on Cluster and Nina and After the Heat. Music films also came out in the 70s. The 80s, Ambient 2, Fourfold Volume 1, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, Ambient 4, Apollo, The Pearl, which is with Howard Budd. In the 90s, had really good stuff like Wrong Way Up. I quite like Nerve Net. Spinner with Joe Wobbles, fantastic. The Drop, I'm a big champion of The Drop. I'll advocate for The Drop. And then in the 2000s, I really like some of that early stuff, early in the decade stuff, like Compact Forest Proposal, like these installation soundtracks which were released, like Compact Forest Proposal, Music of the Civic Recovery Centre, Bell Studies for the Long Now, Drawn from Life with someone named J. Peter Schwalm. Another Eno collaboration, The Equatorial Stars. I really like Another Day on Earth. I'm a huge champion of everything that happens or happened today. I think it's basically a masterpiece, one of my favourites of this century or any. And then in the 2010s, I was a big fan of Smallcraft, Donna Milk Sea with John Hopkins and Leo Abrams. Drums, Pin Bells is interesting. Lux is kind of interesting, kind of, by the numbers, but fairly fun ambient, as in, kind of enriching ambient music. I've do collaborations of Cole Hyder from Underworld, Someday World, and High Life, especially Someday World, which is spectacular. More ambient work in The Ship and Reflection, I like those. But I feel like, Mixing Colours is the best. I mean, it's 2020, we're in a new decade now. It's the best realisation of what Eno is working on from Lux, The Ship and Reflection, which is, going back to those ambient world and trying to perfect it. And it took him and his brother to really kind of
very minimal as well.
Because I think sometimes Eno's like best of a collaborator.
And deliberately minimal too. That's the feeling I get with that sort of stuff. The newer Eno and like you mentioned, him trying to sort of perfect the early ambient releases, 1, 2. Trying to deliberately create something as minimal as possible to see what can come in the in-between spaces.
Yeah.
In the most literal sense,
Yeah. It's like sometimes, I think there's even K-Punk's suggestion of this, that in films or in music, less budget was inducive to more ideas rather than higher budget. You're trying to so hard to achieve these ideas which is concrete and set in your head, and there's no room for experimentation. Why bother? You got the money to just realize it.
With DIY, madness is more the method than preconceived farce. What reminds me of what you were describing is when you watch that documentary of Metallica making the Black Album, and Bob Rock having to force Kirk Hammett into doing this Guns N' Roses style melodic guitar solo.
Yeah.
And it feels like that's what that is,
Yeah.
It's too much budget, and you try to have these concrete ideas in your head of what a thing sounds like, especially a commercial thing in that sense,
Yeah.
And it spoils the artistic endeavor, right?
Yeah.
It no longer becomes a legitimate expression of one's humanity or a collective sense of humanity. It gets tainted by sort of cynicism that is trying to sell people an idea. It's like P.T. Barnum in pop culture.
Well, especially considering in cases like that where it's other people's money, right?
Yeah, and in the case of music, teenagers' money.
Yeah.
So a kid's other person's money, their parents' money, typically, right?
Yeah, it's just if even if you had carte blanche with a carte blanche budget, you have some idea, you'd think sometimes, if you have all the money in the world, your ideas are going to be necessarily maybe a bit comfortable and sort of grandiose, but sort of defined. Whereas low budget, you have all you can think of is all the things you want to do but maybe can't, and sort of kind of almost cutting corners and imagining new possibilities of composition to get there.
Yeah.
Whether it's in a film production context, or whether it's in a music recording context. It's a fascinating thing to think about. For myself at least. But no, I think Brian Eno is continually a champion, and as I just kind of reading about there, a very consistently interesting body of work. Very few people can say that. Most people seem to peter out at some point. I'm not even holding that against them, but sometimes artists like Eno make everyone else look bad in comparison. It's just like, but then again, we are talking about a man who delivered albums like Taking Tiger Mountain and Another Green World, contributing to first 2 Roxy Music albums, and Work of Eno, production tidbits on Lamb Last Out on Broadway, all before he was, probably not that long before, but before he was 30. Really young.
It seems like what you're describing is almost like the tragedy of the way like consumerist thought has exposed art as a human endeavor, where it takes someone like Brian Eno to be able to sort of transcend that and not have to deal with those sort of that world, right?
Yeah.
And to be able to do like commercial, he had to, I guess, most of his money probably comes from deals with Microsoft and stuff like that to make, sounds and stuff.
Producing U2 and Coldplay would help as well, I would imagine.
Yeah, U2, yeah, production jobs for like the biggest album of all time. Yeah, of course, stuff like that. In a sense, it's like the ultimate like art musician has to make like the most mainstream consumer stuff to fund this sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the world we live in is like not everyone can be Brian Eno. That's almost his genius. But the thing is, there's like probably millions of Brian Enos out there. But because of the way we've organized our structures, like these people aren't actually exposed to the world. Yeah. Instead, you have to have someone like Brian Eno who, on top of both being that musical sort of artiste, has to like navigate in a business sense, someone like even George Lucas had to navigate as a smart businessman through this ulterior world. Honestly, I don't want to take away from Brian Eno, but there's probably millions of Brian Enos out there. Like, there are some musical geniuses who'll never be able to navigate their way through the world and the music world specifically, the way that someone like Brian Eno can, or did at least.
We have to be a guy like Brian Eno who's willing to do the crazy Roxy music stuff, and then also have that sensibility to compose the ambient music.
Yeah.
Few people had that drive first.
Yeah, that's true. He did get his in with Roxy, yeah, and very much sort of embodied that sort of the spirit of Roxy music at the time. Definitely. He sort of started in the rock style world, yeah.
Yes. And what's interesting is Eno is one of the most influential individuals on our current culture and aesthetic. Consider the minimal ambient sort of airport aesthetics of the ambient quadrilogy, and then how that made people think about smaller spaces and the harmonious symmetry within capitalism, and the very deliberate nature with which he was recruited to compose music for the budding personal computer era. It's almost as though Eno's ambient philosophy and the artwork of those LPs influenced or were reflective of the coming turn of the millennium new computer age.
Eno's the first cyberpunk in many ways, and he existed before the term did, but he's definitely the first cyberpunk.
So his aesthetic is almost, a lot of contemporary aesthetic can nearly be solely traced back to him, and just the focus on windows and opening and closing windows in a computer screen, and everything being sort of flat and kind of compact and observable, and straight lines, which may have chaos within them, but it's all kind of controlled and manicured. Sounds a bit like Eno's music, doesn't it? It looks, there's a sort of fun synesthesia between the look of the digital era and the sound of Eno's music.
Yeah, and there's a weird jarring thing where, the sound of the boot up of a Mac?
Yeah.
It's just not the same. You're like, oh man, I wish this was Eno.
Those things are made to break.
Which ones?
Apple products.
Yeah?
Well...
The phones definitely. The computers seem to last a while.
They do, but that might be incidental.
Okay. Because the phones are definitely made to be replaced every year.
Maybe I'm just thinking too much of the phones.
It's weird how people always complain about sports video games being like that these days. But in a way, video games and also sports games just took that Apple model and ran with it. And it's almost like the hyper idea of that consumerist thing,
Yeah.
Which music sort of has also fallen into, I suppose, with like Spotify or like streaming services, and people go like, "Oh, where's the good new music?" And it's like, well, it's just all this like hyper commodified bullshit. And like the real good music, you can't just go to streaming services for. Like the distributors aren't going to give you the good stuff. You got to like go somewhere else, you know.
Yeah, you gotta either go to the top rated stuff and rate your music, hope for the best, or better yet, let me filter it and go listen to Mandala Bam to find out more about what it was worth listening to in this crazy, current, unpredictable, but sometimes too predictable world that we live in.
It's pretty
today.
Yeah.
Oh, save us again, Brian Eno. We'll really appreciate it. We'll buy your records again and it'll be great. We'll be happy again.
Imagine if like he did like a Ian Anderson type thing, or it's Brian Eno's taking Tiger Mountain 2.
Oh, like we did those Figures of Brick too?
Yeah.
Oh, I'd be really opposed to that.
Yeah. It
I'd be sad.
I doubt Brian Eno would ever do something.
Stoop to that level.
It seems like a...
Oh, it's a bit sad Ian Anderson, dude. To be honest. I like Ian Anderson, but it was just a bit like, oh, why didn't we do this? What happened next? And it's just like, what? What happened next?
Yeah, no, I'm still waiting.
Who thinks that?
I'm still waiting for Tommy too.
Tommy too. They're too old for that now. Like I wouldn't have put it past. Oh no, they wouldn't be that stupid. We can't touch a classic. They wouldn't want to make it because they have bad memories of making Tommy.
Yeah.
I guess you would.